Welcome to episode 35 of the Filmumentaries podcast. Thanks for joining me again. It's Jamie Benning here, talking to you from the infected zone here in southeast London. We've all got colds at the moment, thankfully just colds. This episode is a bit later than intended. Unfortunately, my daughter's been off school this week with a cough and a cold, which we've now all got. But it's meant that I've not been able to work on this podcast and release it on the date that I intended. And things got away from me a little bit this last couple of weeks, and I'm pleased to say really that I've had quite a busy stint of work, so mustn't grumble about that. I do hope you enjoyed the last episode in which I spoke with storyboard and comic book artist Gabriel Hardman about his work with Chris Nolan and James Mangold and others. I really did enjoy speaking to Gabriel about his art and craft. So for this episode, I have a real treat. I have editor of Monsters and Rogue One, the always fantastic Colin Goudie. We spoke at some length. I think it was about 2.5 hours, just over, which I've edited down to about 2 hours. It's still long, but well worth your time. Colin is a veteran of BBC dramas and documentaries, and he's really very well regarded in the industry. You'll hear as we chat that Colin brings his intelligence and humour to everything he does, including this podcast. But before we head to my chat with Colin, I wanted to welcome any new listeners to the podcast. If you are new, welcome. Please do go and check out some of the previous episodes. There are 34 to choose from, in which I chat to editors, VFX artists, sound designers, directors. You really are spoiled for choice. Do let me know what you think of them. And thanks as always to my lovely generous patrons on patreon.com. It's thanks to you that I'm able to make 2 episodes per month and focus my attention on getting such great guests. And if you'd like to join the Filmumentaries family, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Jamie Benning. Also, please check out filmumentaries.com, the Filmumentaries Facebook group, and what am I on Twitter? @JamieSWB. In fact, if you are on Twitter, if you quote tweet my pinned tweet, which is about this podcast, you could win an exclusive IMAX Rogue One poster. I'll draw the competition in the next episode of the podcast. So all you need to do is quote tweet my pinned tweet, if that makes sense. That is like a retweet with a comment. Tell me how much you love the podcast, and everybody else how much you love the podcast, please. So that's Jamie SWB on Twitter. Okay, so here's my chat with editor Colin Goudie, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So, Colin, what was your education that led you towards becoming an editor?
So I was at school in the 1970s, which is relevant because that meant I could leave school when I was 15, which I did. But I managed to get a place at art school, which I got into when I was 16. And it was a foundation course for 2 years. So you did everything, painting, sculpture. But the thing that I loved was stills photography. And that was 35 millimeter, and you took black and white pictures and you processed them, and then you printed them. And of course, up until then, I'd only ever seen pictures that my parents had got back from Boots, which would have been tiny little, sometimes 2 inches by 2 inches, the pictures. And then when you got a 6x4 was a large print in those days. It really was. So suddenly to be printing, 12 by 8 and stuff like that was just mind boggling to see what you could do. And obviously you could slow down the shutter speeds. We had access to wide angle lenses and telephoto lenses. So it opened up a world of photography that to me as a 16-year-old person, I'd never been exposed to before. And I fell in love with that. And so that's when I started to realize that's the route I kind of wanted to go down. And film school was something I hadn't really ever heard of. And the profession of editing certainly wasn't something I'd ever heard of. I think in my head at that point, my dream was to be a combat stills photographer or a landscape photographer. And those were the 2 routes I really wanted to go down. I had tried to get in to do some combat photography. It was very difficult at that age, as you can imagine. So I did get to do my landscape photography. I then applied to Bournemouth Film School. And their course was a 3-year course, the first year of which was stills photography, with a bit of, you could kind of hang out a bit with the film students, but it was mainly stills photography is what you were supposed to be doing. And then you had to make a short film in order to get onto the second year film course, of which was they only took on 12 people onto that film course. What I did was in my first year, because by then I was so in love with film, I would go to the second year and third year film students and ask if they wanted a unit stills photographer, which obviously everybody always does. You get onto a film set, and as you know, there's always more work to be done than there are people to do it on a film set. So as soon as you're there, people will go, oh, can you go and move that lighting stand? Or can you go and mark the clapperboard for us? Or can you hold the boom? Or whatever. So as long as you don't mess it up, they'll start giving you more and more important tasks. By the end of my first year, I'd already well ingrained myself in with the second year students. So when they became third year students and I managed to get onto the film course as a second year student, the third year students were then asking me if I would come and cut their graduation films. So I was very lucky in that I kind of got a year ahead effectively. And there are other people doing similar sort of things, but I think I was really doing it much more than my contemporaries to that degree. Which also meant by the time I got into my third year, I was, I'd got the experience of cutting graduation films and I mainly concentrated on editing. I did direct a couple of things. I didn't enjoy directing. Directing for me was always a compromise process. Every idea I had in my head got worse and worse and worse, depending on the limitations of cast, money, location, weather, all those things. As an editor, I found it a very creative process because directors would come into me going, I didn't get it. I didn't get the stuff. I didn't get the footage. I didn't get the performance. And I would then be building it and they'd go, oh, it is in there. Oh, how did you manage to do that? And you'd always be improving. So I naturally gravitated towards editing. By the time I graduated, I knew I wanted to be an editor. And I was very lucky that the BBC were running their first trainee assistant film editor course in a few years. And I was even luckier to get on to that. And again, I think there were about 12 of us on that actually as well, around that kind of number. There were thousands and thousands of applicants for that job because there was every film school graduate from across the whole country. But not just for that year, but for the 2 years previous, because they had not been running that course. So I got into the BBC. That was 6 weeks in the classroom, and it was incredibly technical. I recently unearthed my manual of all this technical stuff that I'd had to learn on that course, and it was an A4 binder, and it was probably 4 inches deep of extremely, like the process of how a television worked mechanically, and the laboratory science behind negative and learning D-log E curves, a lot of which I'd covered at film school, but this was much more in depth. So you were 6 weeks in a classroom every single day learning science. Then after that, you did 9 months. If you passed, you had to pass your exam to get out of that classroom. It was then 9 months as a trainee, where you were effectively the second assistant editor, because the BBC didn't have second assistants. So you'd be the editor, there'd be the assistant, and there'd be you, the trainee. And what was brilliant about that was I think it was every 6 weeks, you finished that assignment and you went to the next department. So you did documentaries, you did schools, children's, you did drama, you did so you did documentaries like 30-minute docs. I worked on a series which was an archive show. And then, which was interesting because one of the editors on that was Tariq Anwar, and his assistant was Masahiro Hirakabu. So, you work with people that went on to become.
Yeah.
And then you also worked on things like Panorama or the Money Program, which were very fast turnaround editing on Ektachrome. So you'd get the film, it'd be processed in the lab that day, and your editor would be cutting the transmission master. So your job as the trainee, you would be cleaning the film with the Selvet and spray. You had to be very careful because if you put a scratch down that, it was going to transmit to the entire Panorama audience. There was no chance for reprint. It was Ektachrome. It was the master. It's reversal film for people that don't know. And all of this stuff, obviously, from what I'm saying, you'll gather, was all on film, 16mm film. So you learn, you retrod the boards of everything you've been doing at film school for the previous 3 years, but in the coalface of transmission, particularly on shows like Panorama, and Nationwide as well. Nationwide would shoot in the morning. Sorry, Nationwide was a BBC News program. It was the equivalent of the 6 o'clock news, the bit after the main headlines. They would shoot on film. They would a dispatch rider would take it to the lab in Shepherd's Bush. It would be processed, got to you. You would sync it up. You would hand it to your editor. They would cut it that afternoon, and it would transmit at 6 o'clock in the evening. And that taught you everything you needed to know about how to cut fast. And it also was kind of a learning ground for directors as well. And I remember a director who shot 4 10-minute rolls of film for this news item, and the editor, Laurie Cho, took the 4 cans of film and said, which 2 do you want me to open? Because I'm not even going to bother opening all 4 reels, because I don't have the time to watch 40 minutes of material. Now, that meant that director never overshot ever again, because suddenly he was thinking he was getting all these creative shots. It's like, if your editor does not have time to look at them, you may as well not have shot them. You should have made decisions on the floor of shooting. And if only every director today had to go through that process.
Well, I was going to say,
you work at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I was going to say that clearly that foundation of the BBC really taught you the disciplines of what you needed, from a technical point of view, from handling that physical media, but also, being able to deal with directors and deal with a process that, you would go on to do, but in a less, maybe it is as frantic for you now, I know, but...
I tell you what's really interesting about it, Jamie, is you always think it's never going to get that bad again. Right now, I remember only a few years after that, I was then editing. I was editing a documentary at the BBC, and the final day's filming had taken place effectively as pickup on a documentary, and the cab arrived with the negative that had come from the laboratory and the work print. It came to my edit suite. It was 10 minutes of film. I edited those 10 minutes down into a sequence, which I cut into the finished film while the taxi waited, because then he had to take my cutting copy and that can of neg to the neg cutters for them to neg cut it in time to make transmission. And I was not panicked by that, because I'd worked on those shows a few years ago, whereby I was running down the corridor with the tape, like in broadcast news. I mean, I have literally, again, this was at the BBC. It was on a series called The Late Show, which was a music and arts equivalent of Newsnight. Used to be presented by Kirsty Walk, and we were in the dubbing suite, and it was a 49-minute film for a 50-minute slot. So you had a minute studio intro. We were halfway through the mix, and I looked at the clock and I realized we had about 27 minutes to transmission. And I turned to the series editor, so not a film editor, the series editor. And I said to him, are we going to make this? Because he did it every night, for years. And this was, I'd done a few films for them. And he looked at me and he said, you're the film editor, you tell me. And because obviously the backup plan is they would transmit a different set of films if they had to, if they had anything. And I said to him, we will definitely make it. I turned to Ron Edmonds, the dubbing mixer, and I said, do not stop unless it completely falls off the reel for some, like the level is non-transmittable. Just don't stop. Just carry on going forward the best you can. And I was calling things out to him as we'd hit. I'd get ready to come down on track 5, get ready to fit. And I was talking him through the cue sheet so he could mix it. And we literally were running down the corridor, and I could hear studio going, Kirsty, can you just waffle a little bit?
Oh, no.
We needed those 10 extra seconds to get that cassette in, and it going play. So,
which seems like the longest process ever when it's loaded.
Unbelievable. It's like watching a render bar these days.
Yeah.
You're like, I need to export this. And that has carried on. And even on films I've edited in the last few years, I have sat there with the assistants going, it's got to leave the Avid now to get to the studio in time for us to, and I'm like, just give me 1 more minute, I can make this, you know. And I'm always very calm when I'm doing that, because I know I've done worse. I know a bit, nothing's ever going to be as close as Kirsty Walk saying, and in tonight's program, which is yet in the playback machine. So I think it was the best training ground of all time.
How long were you there at the BBC then?
So I was then there for, here's my game plan was go to the BBC, get my union ticket, leave, go and work in features. And you had to work for 2 years to get your union ticket. And I was there for 10 years. So my plan went completely to cock, because basically why leave? I was working with the best editors, you know, on the best programs, on a staff pensionable job, you know, and it was brilliant. I mean, like when I first started, my first job in the drama department on a BBC, you know, feature film effectively was An Englishman Abroad, which was Alan Bennett, Coral Brown. It won the BAFTA, and the director was John Schlesinger. And I would sit in the screening room, just me and John Schlesinger. Now, why are you going to leave that job?
No, exactly. You've got everything you need right there.
And there was a career path. So I was very lucky in the editors that I worked with early on, like very early on, within my first year or two, because my long-term plan had been 10 years to make it to editor. And I knew assistants that had been there for 16, 17 years. I was very lucky that the editors I worked for were very happy to hand me sequences to cut. And there was one editor who he wasn't dialing it in. When he was there, he was very committed to it. But he would also, when it was a program that wasn't so important, because obviously you're covering everything at the BBC, and I say not so important. So if you're doing a schools documentary, it's a 30-minute all film documentary, but it's basically going to transmit to school children or you know, OU students. So it's about the educational side of it rather than the film craft side of it, if that makes sense. So he would go on holiday and he'd leave me to look at the rushes and cut the rushes, and then he'd phone it. And this is the day of phone boxes. He'd go to a phone box after a week, he'd ring me up, he'd go, how's it going? I go, yeah, no, it's going really good. He'd go, okay, I think I'm going to stay on holiday for another week. Is that okay? Any reason I need to come back? And I go, nope, it's all good. And he came in eventually on this film, and he went, how's it going? And I said, I've got my final viewing with the exec this afternoon. And he went, brilliant. And he'd never seen the film. And he sat down in that viewing, and there was myself, the director, and the exec, and that was the first time he'd ever seen it.
Brilliant. But that, I mean, that serves two purposes, doesn't it? Because that allows him to have a break to come back to the bigger stuff fresh, but it also gives you as an assistant the chance to do something, you know, that is done in its entirety.
Exactly.
And develop your skills.
Exactly. And what was brilliant, because you are not just learning the skill of where to cut, you are learning the skill which is very hard to learn at film school or anywhere else, really, dealing with production. The relationship with you and the director, the relationship with you, the director and the producer, and you, director, producer, and the network. And those are all things that you only learn that when you're in that situation yourself. And you can learn it by being in the room when it happened, as they say in Hamilton, when you're watching how your editor deals with those people. And that's what I picked up on all those traineeships, all those 6-week slots. But then you are sitting there and you're the one answering the questions, and you're the one trying to come up with ideas that you would like them to accept as, well, what about if we do this with the voiceover? Or I know you wanted this piece of music, but I've come up with this piece. Is this any better? And you're trying to persuade them as to the validity of your idea.
Yeah, I guess there are sort of two types of editors in that regard, in as much as there are some that will sort of follow exactly what is expected of them, and others, sounds like yourself, where you will come up with suggestions that aren't necessarily what the director wanted, but you found during the process of editing that probably is the better option. Right. And that's why you are where you are, and then why some people remain edit assistants for 16 years. Yeah,
it's absolutely true. And also, as a side note to that, I always try and do the director's version first. But if I have time, that's why it's always good to get very clear instruction from the director, so you can get through their version quickly without trying to, oh, what do they want here? What did they want there? So do that, and then have time to do your alternate, and sometimes doing the director's version, you will do the director's version, you will do your version, you will show them both. And then for me, the absolute best moment is when the director says, okay, I love what you've done there. I prefer my version in the second half of that scene. I love how you've introed that scene. Can we take the first half of your scene and the second half of my scene, whatever. And from that, you make a new version that neither of you would have thought of separately.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's I'm talking about in a scene level. It can be on a micro level of a cut per cut that you do that. Oh, I love that cut there of yours, but I prefer the way you did that cut in my version. So you're building you're taking the Lego bricks and you're building a new, toy from it, basically.
Yeah, you're almost sort of creating the two extremities in a way, like you've walled yourself into a certain garden, and then you come up with a new one in between. Yeah, that's a great approach. Yeah. And do you kind of continue to treat your assistant editors in the same way that you were treated, in as much as you were given projects to do? Do you give them projects to do?
I've never gone away on holiday and left them cut the entire film. I live for
not quite that bad, yeah.
However, I absolutely, I think if you spoke to anybody that's ever assisted me, I'd like to think, certainly, I mean, and I'm not so much at the BBC era, when I would do to some degree, but much more now as an established freelancer, where people they hire me because they respect my work, and therefore they respect my decision when I say, well, I'm going to let the assistant cut that. I have the clout to make, whereas you have to have the clout to let your director go along, make your director go along with that. They're hiring me.
Yes, of course.
So, and I will always say to them, I'm going to give, my assistant this scene to cut. And usually what I try to do is the same thing that happened when I was an assistant, is if there are changes to be made that are easy, then I will always say to the director, look, Chris or Jan, whichever my assistant is, I will say, they cut this scene. I want them in the room when we discuss this scene. Mm-hmm. If possible, if they're not still doing dailies or something, whenever possible, I'll have them sit in the room. And I want them to do the changes. And they can either go off and do those changes and present them back to us for the next screening, or you can sit with them. I'm not afraid of that. I know some editors get very afraid of, oh, I might lose my future work because the director might prefer to work with my assistant.
Right.
Well, if that's the case, then they probably are better off working with your assistant.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's your job to make them realize, okay, I liked working with that assistant, but I prefer working with Cole.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or hopefully when I retire, I really like working with Cole's assistant, and now I'm going to when I'm busy on another film, giving my assistant a break. So I absolutely do that whenever possible.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, when you go from somewhere like the BBC into the freelance world, there's that often said line where, you're only as good as your last job. So I would imagine in those early days that you were making choices with that in the back of your mind, as I have as a freelancer for many years. You want to put yourself into a situation where you learn something new and you're challenged.
Yes.
But at the same time, you don't want to jump too deeply into the water,
Right. I've never had that luxury.
You've just jump in with 2 feet.
Literally those kids from that movie, the Peter Yates movie about the cyclists breaking away, who jumped to the quarry. I am totally that person that jumps into the quarry. So, and when I went freelance, the shocker to me for first going freelance was the very last thing I did at the BBC was cutting on Super 16 film. Right. I had edited on tape, both Beta SP and Pneumatic and all those things at the BBC. Sometimes they were films that were shot on film, be it 16 or 35, that had been transferred to videotape, and then I'd edited them that way, and then they'd been conformed, or they'd been shot on tape and I was cutting on tape. So all of those different technologies I'd used. The last job I happened to do was an Inspector Allen film. It was a 2-hour film for the BBC, and it was on 16mm, Super 16. So my last cut was on a joiner with a piece of sellotape. When I went freelance, the very first job I had a phone call from a producer for a 8-part series for the BBC. It was very short. There were 15-minute episodes. It was about volunteering. So people like lifeboat rescuers and people who, VSO overseas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every kind of volunteering you could imagine. That was what the series was all about. And he was directing one of the episodes himself, but one of the other directors had never worked with me, but she knew of me from the BBC. She recommended me for the job. So I basically kind of got the job on the phone with this guy. And then he said, and we're cutting on Lightworks. That's not a problem, is it? And I went, no, it's not a problem at all. Hung up the phone, dialed directory inquiries and said, hi, is there a phone number for a company called Lightworks? And she put me through, and I went, hi, Lightworks. I went, hi, what is a Lightworks, and where can I learn how to use one? and I was starting that job like a week later, and I didn't even have a home computer.
Wow.
So I paid, I think it was £800 for a 2 days course. Now that was more than a week's wages in those days. And I did my 2 days course, and then I was in the following week cutting on this system, but with no assistant. And in those days, the equipment was so expensive. A Lightworks in those days was £60,000, which was the same price of a flat in London. So to put that into perspective for your listeners today, it's effectively £400,000 to £500,000 worth of equipment. Because of that, they didn't have two, so one for your assistant and one for you. Obviously, cutting on film, my assistant had a pick sync, and a chronograph, and a roll of sellotape. That was the outlay for equipment for an assistant editor.
Wow.
And it wasn't viable. So it wasn't until I got to work on dramas a couple of years later that I finally was able to get an assistant in. And that was mainly to ingest and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was thinking, I had a bit of a sort of experience with Lightworks, in as much as I worked for a company called London Editing Machines in the early 2000s, who would, that period where people were still had film benches, but they had a Chem or they had a Steenbeck, but they'd have an Avid there or a Lightworks. And Lightworks seemed to be very popular amongst the editors that had come from film, because I think it was something to do with the kind of input device.
It was always, I managed to stay on Lightworks exclusively from 1993 until 1998. And the reason was because everything I was doing in those, I was doing almost exclusively drama series and drama films. And it was definitely the best suited piece of equipment for that. And like you say, it had a controller that was very similar to the Steenbeck controller. You physically moved your hand on the jog wheel, and if you did that, it was just like using your pick sync. You were at one with the machine. It was very zen.
Felt mechanical as well. Mechanical, yeah.
But it thought like a film editor did in terms of unpicking the joins, and it was just like dealing with that. There was no file drop down insert menu, none of that nonsense. I used to call it like the kids' toy Tomy, like you get Tomy my first typewriter and Tomy my first laptop, and I would call it Tomy my first edit suite. It had a big red button to stop, the film, which VT editors used to come in and go, oh my God, is that the record button? And you go, no, that's the stop button. Because in a film edit suite, red is stop, not record. And it had filing cabinets, the icons that looked like filing cabinets, and it had search card, and it automatically saved your project. It totally backed. There was no Apple F save. It did all of that for you. What was interesting was in 1999, I inherited a documentary series that had previously been started by another editor who'd started that on Avid. So I had to, again, got the phone call for the job. It's cutting on Avid. You okay with that? I was like, well, I've used Avid, but I'm not fast on it. I'd never used an Avid. I'd never seen an Avid. So I drove from my house in Scotland down to the edit suite in London with a friend reading me the Avid manual in the car as I drove for 8 hours. Which was great because I had to learn how to turn a Mac on. I was like, what? You push the Apple key. The what key? There's an Apple key? What? It's like, we're explaining this to, and my friends are reading the manual. Like,
oh my gosh.
Control. He was like, oh my God. Anyway, got in there. I was cutting on that for a few days, and I felt so slow compared to my speed on a Lightworks. And I thought they're going to sack me. And the director said to me, "I thought you said you were really slow on this." And I was like, thinking this is the moment. And he went, "God, you are so much quicker than the guy we fired."
Right.
He was an Avid editor.
Oh, wow.
So it went well. And then what I learned from that experience was I felt that Avid was the much better tool for cutting documentaries, and Lightworks was the much better tool for cutting drama.
Right.
And I can
What was the
quantify
distinction? Yeah.
Right. So, and this is still used. I know this is going back 20 years now, but it's useful to think about the tool for the job. With the Lightworks, you would uncurl your timeline and you'd scroll down your rushes, a few frame to get you want a few more frames on the head of this shot or that shot. And when you're cutting a drama, once you've put the scene together the first time, now it is possible to go back and completely redo stuff, and we often do, but basically the way you're working is you started on the wide shot. I'm just exampling here, then you go into a mid shot, and then you go into your close-up character A, close-up character B. Now, when you are cutting the scene, you would never take the wide shot that is the first shot in the film, in the scene, and make it the fourth shot in the scene without going back to the rushes, because the piece of action that is happening 4 lines of dialogue later is a completely different line to the line that was at the top. So you have had to go back to rushes to achieve that, right? Which the Lightworks would do perfectly. When you're cutting a documentary, you might have 10 shots in the timeline, and you quite often are taking shot 1 and moving it to position 4 in the scene, and position 4 becomes position, and you're not going back to rushes. You're using that exact same clip. You're just putting it in a different place. You're going rain, roof leak, bucket drip. You're going bucket drip, roof leak, rain. You're just shifting. You're not shifting the actual content within the shot. You're just moving the shot. On a drama, you don't do that. Once you shift the order, you have to go back to the rushes to find what they were saying in the close-up on line 1. You can't put line 4 in position 1. And that's how those two pieces of equipment worked. And that was their strengths and their weaknesses. That's why Avid was rubbish for cutting drama, and it's why Lightworks was not as good for cutting docs.
That's interesting, yeah, because I guess with documentaries, you're crafting the story from all these disparate pieces, whereas with a drama, it's kind of scripted, and therefore you're sort of restricted to what you can and can't do. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's the reason why. And in those days, I used to have the ultimate power of choosing whatever I wanted to work on, edit suite wise. So I would say, I want to cut this on an Avid, or I want to cut this on a Lightworks. And then later on, in 2006, I had a director who insisted on doing a short film on Final Cut Pro. So I learned that, and I did that on a short film. And that stood me in good stead, because then when I got a properly paid job that was on Final Cut Pro, I'd learned how to use it, baptism of fire, cutting this short film, So it's always that thing. And that's something I still do to this day. If I'm cutting a short, I'll quite often see that's what I'm going to try and do, the latest version of the software. Whereas if I'm going on to a feature, I want that most rock solid Avid 2018.12, that's never going to fall over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't do that. Don't jump into 2021.08 on a feature. You have to have a huge resource of time to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like in the bit of the industry that I work in live TV, we use Premiere, and I'm always very reluctant to upgrade. If because like you were describing earlier, we're sometimes playing things to air that haven't been finished editing yet. So they're coming out of like an EVS or something, but we're editing the part 2 on a Premiere, and
yeah, absolutely.
I want to make sure
Premiere as well. So I've used Premiere for both shorts and for features. And in fact, back in the 1990s, I think I got my first copy of Premiere in the 1994-5, because in those days Premiere could digitize a mini DV tape at full quality, SD quality, which neither Lightworks or Avid can do. They were heavily compressed. People these days would not understand the quality of what we were working with back in the day. Just how blocky the footage was.
Well, yeah, that's it. And you're trying to, craft something, and you're working in a really low resolution. Do you think that there is now one editing suite that kind of fulfills most of the things that you need from it?
if I'm doing a feature and I'm doing a feature with not just myself, I've got assistants and VFX editor, then at the moment I would absolutely still stick with Avid. Absolutely, because of its reliability across multiple edit suites in multiple locations. The feature film I just finished, my first was in Mauritius. I was up here in my cottage in Scotland, and my second was in London, and my VFX person was down in Brighton. So that was very good. The data management of it. Once you get a file, it links to everybody. There's no, you almost never get media offline. And if there is, there's a pretty simple fix for it. I think that if I was doing something that was very heavily, had a lot of titles, then I would probably want to be doing that in Premiere, because obviously the title tool on Avid is not fit for purpose. And the integration of using Photoshop and After Effects with Premiere, it's the natural thing to do. They all still have weaknesses. They all still have strengths. Yeah. And Lightworks, you can still get Lightworks. It's now obviously, you can still make it work with an old jog wheel if you want that physical interface, but you can just use it on a keyboard, and it's obviously very cost effective to use. It's still used on big features in Hollywood by certain editors who only use Lightworks.
Is it really? Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, I use iPhone, my iMovie on my iPhone.
Well, yeah.
And on my iPad, if that's what the job dictates. If I'm doing something that's 2 minutes long and they need it now, I will cut it on my phone, because I know I can just go export straight from phone. It's the tool for the job.
Yeah, it's already there ready for you to send out in the form that you want it. So moving on to some of the sort of named features that my listeners will know of. Monsters, obviously, I think was probably the first film that I became aware of your work. How did you meet Gareth Edwards, and what was it like shooting that film? Because it was done in a very short period on a very low budget.
Yeah.
Across multiple countries.
Yep. Okay. So I was first aware of Gareth's work because he did the VFX on a BBC TV series called 7 Wonders of the Industrial World. And one of the episodes of that, The Sewer King, was directed by Ed Bazalgette. He used to be my assistant, and he wanted me to cut it, but I wasn't available. But I watched the film go out, because I always watch things that I didn't get to cut. And I was like, that was amazing. Damn, I should have done that job. And I was like, the VFX for TV was stunning, and I knew what the budget had been on the VFX. And I'd worked on a lot of TV VFX shows. And I was like, how on earth did they get their VFX that good on that budget? And then I learned about Gareth, and he was one man band and all the rest of it. And then I got to cut Space Race for the BBC, which was their follow-up series to the 7 Wonders. And again, Gareth was doing the visual effects. So I was already a fan of his work before I ever met him. I was used to sitting with a VFX supervisor in my edit suite and me telling them what I wanted, and them telling me that that was not achievable on the budget, or it was achievable, and then the shot would come back, it'd be nothing like what I asked for. With Gareth, I would tell him what I wanted, and I was basing this decision creatively on what I knew the money was in the budget for that shot. And Gareth would go, well, I can do that, but what I could do is I could make the camera go around the Vostok capsule and then show you the Earth. And I go, you can do that for the same money? And Gareth would go, oh yeah. And I would go, oh, let's do that. That's way better, And we would just sit there for hours. And of those hours, most of it would be talking about Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. What did we think of Spielberg's War of the Worlds? Things like that. So we became really good friends. And then the couple of years after that, he got to do Heroes and Villains, Attila the Hun film. And he asked me to cut that. I leapt at the chance. In fact, he didn't ask me to cut it. The BBC asked me to cut it, and the producers phoned up. And I'd worked with the producers before on a series about ancient Rome. And they said to me, Gareth Edwards is doing this film for us. And I went, yep, I'm there. And they then, like double glazing salesmen, they carried on with the sales pitch. And I was going, you had me at Gareth Edwards. I just don't care. And I went to Bulgaria and we did that show. And I think that was a 3-week shoot, if I'm remembering correctly. It was either 3 or 4 weeks. It was for an hour-long slot. But in fact, we came back with a film that was almost 90 minutes, which was to do with the script. The script was far too long. And there was a big debate when they watched our first cut as to whether they would turn it into a 90-minute feature length film. And in the end, because it was part of an overall series, each episode was about a different historical figure. So Richard the Lionheart, Napoleon, ours was Attila the Hun. It was decided we would cut ours down to the hour.
Right.
Which was a shame because we lost a lot of really amazing stuff that Gareth had shot. But it meant that obviously because Gareth then did all the visual effects on that himself. And it meant he could do it in the 6 months he had so, to make transmission. So on the back of that, he asked me to come and do Monsters, which was his first feature. And a lot of people are under the misapprehension that Gareth was somebody who did visual effects who went into directing. It's the other way around. Gareth was a director who, after directing for many years, learnt about visual effects and realized that if he learned how to do visual effects himself, he could make his own films look much bigger, much more impressive. And so that's what he did. And then he got, as he calls it, stuck in the world of television visual effects for 10 years because he was so good at it and he was so cheap that everybody hired him, and he kept putting off getting back into his directing career, which he then did with Attila. He actually did a film called End Day, which Gareth hates it. I think it's a really great thing for people who are starting off, particularly to look at. It is on YouTube. And it's basically Groundhog Day, but each day the world is destroyed a different way. And Gareth did, again, all the visual effects for that. He actually shot it in his bedroom. So there are shots outside, but like every day, the guy who wakes up, that used to be Gareth's old bedroom that the scientist wakes up in, and Gareth's elevator that the TV is on. So again, I'd seen that. I was really impressed with the way he directed that. When we did Attila, even more so. Attila was such a good piece of work for the time it was made. It obviously looked very dated now. But when we were in the edit suite cutting Monsters, we had a phone call from George Lucas, who'd watched it go out in America the night before, and he wanted to hire Gareth for the then projected Star Wars TV series that George Lucas was going to make. Wow. And that was 2008, 2009. And Rick McCallum spoke to Gareth, and he went and had an interview with them about the series. And he said, "Yeah, I don't want to get back into effects and things. I'm just directing my first film." And they said, "Well, we'd love to see that when it comes out." The rest is history. So how was Monsters? The Monsters was, I was saying to you earlier about how I was used to cutting things on a tight deadline and moments like that. And there had been many of those kind of, I worked on a film where the lead actor died of a heart attack and we had to reshoot with another actor, all his shots. Right? I worked on the BBC's first ever Dolby Stereo a film where we didn't even have a manual to learn how to do that. I've kind of worked on all sorts of, things where everything that could go wrong went wrong. All of that was about that. It was about, 20% of how hard Monsters was. It was exponentially so much harder. And I would never have been able to cut Monsters if I had not had all those years of experience beforehand. Because I had to draw on everything I knew about cutting documentaries and about cutting drama and about storytelling to make that film into what it was. We were cutting it on Premiere and we crashed every day approximately. I used to keep a diary, a log of the crashes, and 30 crashes a day was not unusual. Every time I made a cut, I'd do Control Save. And that was all because Gareth wanted to do the visual effects in After Effects, and we needed to interlink the two with an Ethernet cable so that he would just do a VFX and it would pop up in my timeline. So it saved Gareth, hours and hours and hours of exports and imports and all those things, and it cost me hours and hours and hours of reboots.
And you were editing that as it was being shot. We were
editing that as it was being shot. I was editing it on location in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Texas. And on a laptop, and because Premiere would crash all the time, it meant that if you ran your rushes at anything other than 24 frames per second forwards, it would crash. So as soon as you got to a bit where Gareth was filming the floor, because he never turned the camera off, for 5 minutes, you've got 20, 30 years of experience, which is you double spool. I'd hit the double spool button and it would crash. And I'd be like, oh God. And if you stopped and you went backwards, it would crash. So I was watching rushes and editing going forwards at 24 frames per second only during the duration of the shoot. When we got back to the UK, we got a proper main crate and, things speeded up, but it still would crash 30 times a day.
Really?
Um,
There was quite a lot of improvisation on that shoot as well, wasn't there? Where he would let the camera roll and the
and
actors do their
utterly
thing.
improvised.
Yeah.
And what he would do though, so there was a story. Gareth had written the story. He'd workshopped that with the actors and with the story department at Vertigo. And what he would do is when he was filming, because he was operating the camera himself, it was a very small crew, he would yell out lines or ideas to the actors. He'd say this, go over there, go pick up that, go over to that guy on the bike, and they would go off and do that. And then the actors would bring into that all their own improvisation as well. So like there's a scene in the movie where they're on the doorstep in the motel and Scoot's character Calder is talking about dolphins. He ad-libbed all that because the day before, on their day off, they went swimming with dolphins. So he'd heard all this stuff from the dolphin expert and he just regurgitated it all the next day because it was like, oh, this, what am I going to do as a chat up line? Okay. And he does that. Oh, you're a marine biologist, aren't you? So all that was off the cuff, totally improvised. And what would happen is, although it was a drama, it was shot like a documentary, in that they didn't repeat the lines. So I never, ever had coverage. I only ever had actuality. So as soon as I was on the reverse angle, there was not the same dialogue. I couldn't ever choose where to cut based on the dialogue that was being said. I always had to make my cut based on when did Gareth Nix wander off with the camera to go film something else. And at that moment, did I have enough room to complete the story, the train of thought over the actor who's listening and about to respond? And all of that was documentary editing skill set. And the amount of times I would cut out pauses and words just to cram under the reaction listening shot enough of the dialogue before I no longer had a listening shot, because it was never run for the duration of the scene like you would do normally in a drama. We have your reaction shot now for as long as my dialogue lasts. I didn't have that. I had it for as long as Gareth didn't get bored in that camera position, which was usually a few seconds. And then
it sounds like a nightmare.
Well, I mean, my wife's passed away now, but she worked as an editor on that film with me, and she was almost exclusively documentary editor and would work on a huge doc series that would film over multiple years. So she was used to dealing with thousands of hours of footage, and she came in and she looked at a scene, looked at the rushes, and she went, oh my God, this stuff's almost uncuttable. And I said, it is almost uncuttable. If you go through the pain barrier, you will find the gem. You will find the diamond. You've just got to find it. And that's true on all films, but nothing like to the extent it was on this.
Yeah, I've heard Gareth talk about that kind of shooting till you find that moment of truth that he calls it. Yeah. And then it's your job to find that amongst the hours and hours.
Yeah. I would say to people, you could effectively sit down and watch the 120 hours of rushes for Monsters, and it would be a continuous story because they just improved it and carried on.
How aware were you at the time when you were editing it and making the film with Gareth that it was, essentially a stepping stone for both of your careers?
Very. And I thought it was going to be an absolutely ginormous hit. I thought that film was going to be bigger than Blair Witch. I genuinely did. I think I was the only person involved in that film that did. Even Gareth was kind of like worried it was going to become a straight to DVD film. And I literally, from day one, it was interesting actually, because on the very first day of filming, I remember Gareth went off and he filmed a scene at the train station. And he came back after a few hours. And that very first day, he said, I don't need to come to set, because I would go to set. I say set. I would go with them to the real location, because I was filming the making of film. And which I often do on films I work on, particularly low budget films, just because it's a way of getting involved. And and it means I get to see what rushes I'm going to get later on that day. So, and he said, I don't want you to turn it because I don't want people to see you filming me, because then it'll become a big deal. And I'm kind of trying to go as stealth as possible. So I was like, okay, that's fine. So I stayed back at the hotel. He came back a few hours later and he said, we're going to need to pay excess baggage for these rushes because there's gold in them, as he held the bag of tapes up. We didn't use any footage that he shot that first morning in the finished film. So he came back thinking it was really good stuff. And then the stuff we got later on was so much better, we binned it all.
Bloody hell. Did he become more disciplined over the shoot, do you think,
No.
Gareth? No. But he must have done now, because, I mean, he's now working on
Yeah.
much bigger movies.
I mean, it sounds like chaos. It wasn't chaos. It was just a way of achieving. I mean, I'm sure Blair Witch, if you look at their rushes, I bet you their rushes were even more uncuttable than ours, right? So it wasn't. It was deliberate. It was a film making choice, and I guess one of the reasons I got that gig was because Gareth knew with my docs background, I could pull something together out of the bag. And he'd seen what I'd done with his footage that he'd filmed on Attila, which was much less chaotic, but it was still shot. I mean, Rob Goudie, who was the brilliant cameraman on Attila, Rob and Perry, they shot A&B camera on that, and they were both used to filming documentaries, even though they did loads of dramas. But so everything on Attila was handheld, 2-camera handheld. Or they did do dolly and tracks, but it was shot in that kind of verite style. And so again, like Perry, the second unit camera, the B camera on that, he would be running around outside, just constantly filming extras, just standing there waiting to be called on set in their costumes, because they're standing there looking like a grumpy Hun. He's thinking Cole might be able to use that shot. And so hours and hours of footage that Perry shot, as well as the main unit that Rob was shooting. And then we get into the dialogue scenes and they do A and B. So Gareth had obviously picked up from that. Yes, he is much more structured on his shoot on the bigger films, but he also still does, because Gareth operates whenever possible like Gareth physically operated most of Rogue, really, and if you on it, he does run around the set just filming anything. Like, there's hours. So I mean, obviously not on the dialogue scenes on that. So on Monsters, the dialogue scenes were like that as well. On, say, Rogue, the dialogue scenes were very structured, dolly shots, tracking shots, static shots, all those things. But when you've got a scene like when the rebels attack the Imperial tank that's going through Jeddah, Gareth operated all of that, apart from the explosions, which were 4-camera or whatever. And he filmed the crap out of it. And he'd just get Felicity, no, run in again. No, running again. No, come back. Let's run in again. And he won't cut. He'll just keep filming and filming and filming until, as you say, he gets the diamond, the moment. And even with some of the dialogues, like the dialogue scenes, because obviously that's why he hires actors that are good at improv. So Ben Mendelsohn it never, ever does anything the same twice in any take. Ben was a harder nightmare to edit than Scoot and Whitney improving the whole of Monster. He would literally be in the different room. I mean, there are scenes with Ben. He's here, and then he's here. There's a load of stormtrooper. Ben will be here, and he'll do it. Take 4. He's over here. He's delivering the same dialogue. He does the same dialogue. He'll improvise some lines occasionally, but he'll definitely improvise his performance in terms of, on this take, I'm going to give you Smiley credit. On this one, I'm going to give you Stone. And he's just totally different every time.
And then you've got to craft a performance out of it.
God, what can I cut to? So when I cut back, I can put Ben in the right place. But again, brilliant actor.
Yeah.
It's and that's the kind of people that Gareth hires, because he likes that.
What was the reaction to Monsters? I mean, I remember the kind of buzz. What was it? 2010, wasn't it? I remember the buzz around my film fan friends just going, "You've got to check this out! Oh my god!" And apparently, it was done, on this tiny budget. And what was the reaction amongst your contemporaries and also people sort of at the top of the industry? There must have been some interesting feedback.
I remember when the film came out that I believe somebody from Working Title saw Monsters, and then they made all of the entire Working Title staff watch Monsters, and they said, this is the future of filmmaking. Interestingly, Working Title then never made a film like Monsters. They still continue to make $80 million Bridget Jones movies. But at the time, they really thought this was the sea change. We had a letter from Ridley Scott who said, it was written to Gareth. Gareth brought it into the edit and said, look at this. And it was, I've just watched Monsters in the preview theatre here, and it ended, and I instantly got onto the talkback mic to the projectionist, and I said, I want to run that again from the top. He goes, and I never do that on a film. And Scoot, when we were in South by Southwest at the world premiere, came up to me afterwards, and he said to me, man, we spoke shit for 120 hours, and you made that. And also, so the first time I kind of knew that I wasn't delusional. Actually, I remember we were walking to the tube one night, and a couple of things. First of all, was Gareth said to me at one point when we walked to the train station at like 11 at night, coming out of the edit, he goes, "Oh God, I've made a love story, haven't I?" And I was like, "Yep, you have." And he was, "I wanted to make a horror film. How have I ended up making a love story?" And then the other thing was, again, that we were having some problems with that cut. In terms of people understanding it and believing in the project and believing what we were making. And we were under a lot of pressure to cut it down and make it even more commercial. And Gareth said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "Fuck them all. That film's going to outlive you and me." And Gareth went, "Really? Do you think so?" And I was like, "Definitely." And then I think he felt a bit more confident. Because it was his first feature. He was still very young and very, he was in his 30s. He was in his early 30s. So, and I was the old, grumpy git going, "It's brilliant." Naysayers. And and when we did just before we flew to South by Southwest, we had to check the DCP. And we thought, we're not going to hire a cinema and sit in there just two sad old guys watching this film. So we asked all our friends, about 30, 40 people, to come and watch the film with us. And there were editors and, people, all post people, behind the scenes people, and VFX people. And we afterwards went and had a drink to steady our nerves. And in fact, the film ended and nobody said anything. Nobody said, and they just got up and walked out. And Gareth said he thought it was a complete disaster and everybody had hated it. And in fact, I think everybody was just in a complete state of shock, because they walked through to the bar and everybody was going, "Oh my God, that was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Oh my God, oh my God." And they're like, people were trying to process it. And an editor came up to me and she said, "I thought that was so beautifully cut. And now I've just discovered you cut that on Premiere. And I can't believe you managed to do that." And that's when I thought, oh, somebody understood my pain of the last year, 9 months in that.
It's great to have all those different levels of feedback from, from Ridley Scott down to somebody who can really understand what you guys went through.
And Monsters is and Monsters is not dissimilar to a number of films I've done in my career. Monsters is absolutely a Marmite film. It has 1-star reviews and 5-star reviews, almost no 3-star reviews. People have literally said to me, "I want my money back. I want the 90 minutes of my life back." I've seen so many people get up and walk out of the cinema during screenings of Monsters, and other people have watched it. They said to me, "I've watched that movie 20 times," So yeah,
it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I really like it. But it's like it's an art movie with the name and the looks of a blockbuster somehow. It's not what people expect, I think, is what it is. And some people are surprised, like I was, in a positive way, and other people kind of go, "Well, that's not what I've paid for."
Right. And I think the title had a lot to do with that. A movie called Monsters, you should have some monsters in it. There are no monsters in it. There are only creatures in it. And the only reference to monsters is of the US military. And which is obviously, you take from it, you read from it what you like. And I've always had people say, "Geez, you gave Donald Trump that idea to build a wall, didn't you, between America and..." So
I don't think Trump has watched that movie.
No, it's very funny how people, the insults you get. People got so abusive online to Gareth about the lack of monsters in his film called Monsters, that he sat down and he watched Jaws, and he timed it on an Avid, and he cut together every shot of the barrel. So he didn't even have to see a fin, just the barrel or the pier in the water. He considered a shark shot, and there's still more monsters in Monsters than there is shark in Jaws. So around about 4 minutes 10 seconds or something. Gareth's got the exact figure somewhere.
So maybe Godzilla was the antidote to that, just to get full frame.
How watching, because I saw some of the rushes from Godzilla with Gareth, and then next time I saw it was in the premiere with Gareth. So I was sat next to Gareth at the premiere, and for the first half of the movie I was like, he's not showing the creature. That's brilliant. He's not showing Godzilla. It's so Gareth to do that. And then you get it in spades, and he's totally like that. He loves, and because Gareth grew up with Close Encounters and Jaws as two of his biggest inspirations, and neither of those movies blow that early on. They all save it. They make you wait for the mothership. They make you wait for the shark.
Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. Yeah, right.
Absolutely. And one of the things I was trying to do in the edit with Gareth on Monsters was, I was aware of the fact we were making a film which was ostensibly we were trying to do the suspense horror thing as much as the love story, and we had very little of that. And in the edit, we had none of it because we didn't have any visual effects, and we were still testing it. So you had to test a movie where it said tentacle as a piece of text font and creature as a font. Nothing there, just actors going, and so I was saying that, so like there's a moment when they're in the jungle and it's really, really, really quiet, and then there's the sound of the engine starting, which is like a bang, and everybody jumps. That's because I put a shotgun cartridge going off on that like 2 frames before that cut. And Gareth was like, "Oh no, I don't like that. It's going to make people jump." And no, and it's not going to work, and all the rest of it. And I was going, "Trust me, it'll work. Trust me, it'll work." And then the other one was, there's a twig snapping when Scoot's trying to get his camera back from the dead gorilla in the jungle, and Whitney's in the van. And again, I put this, you don't even see a twig snapping. I just put that sound effect under the footstep just before the cut. On both occasions at South by Southwest, the first time we saw it with a world premiere audience, 600 people shot back in their seats, and went, "Oh," and then they went, "Oh," like that. And on both, Gareth kind of looked at me and smiled and did a thumbs up, because it was like, "Yeah, you were right. I should have trusted you. I did trust you, but I didn't really trust you. But now it's paid off." Because that was an audience that absolutely were going to see a horror film and weren't getting delivered on it. So every little one of those moments gave us another 5 minutes when we didn't have to show the creature.
Yeah, but those sort of moments pull you in one direction as an audience, and then you subvert that by not conforming to what people expect, later on with the movie. But that movie, and then Godzilla for Gareth, it was, is a direct through line for the two of you to Rogue One. How did Rogue One come about? And can you talk a little bit about that film?
So it was when we were at the premiere of Godzilla. Gareth and I, before Godzilla, Gareth and I had been working on a science fiction film together, which was our follow-up to Monsters. Not plot-wise, but it was going to be our next movie. And it was sci-fi. Every shot was a VFX shot pretty much. And we did a test, proof of concept. So we shot it out in Wadi Rum, where they filmed Lawrence of Arabia. And I'd cut it all together. We did all the VFX, and it's this is all in the. You can Google this, and it was Timur Bembekov, the director of Day Watch Night Watch. He was producing it, and then Gareth got Godzilla, so he went off down on that route. I'd been ill, I'd been in hospital and stuff, so that's what I'd been paying my dues doing. And then we finally got together again at the Godzilla premiere, and I was like, "So, now you've got that out your way, are we going to go off and finally go back and finish this other film?" And Gareth was like, yeah, I'll call you. We'll have a chat. I'm gonna come up to Scotland. Something to tell you. Can't tell you here. So, okay. Then a couple of weeks later, I had to drive up to Scotland for surgery. That's right, the next day. So then Gareth phoned me up and he said, "Oh, sorry, he didn't. He WhatsApped me on my iPad." And he said, "What's the best number to phone you on?" And I said, "The landline in Scotland." And he said, "What happened to that mobile I bought you?" And I said, "I dropped it in the bath. It's in the conservatory drying off in a bag of rice. Sorry, mate." And he went, "Damn, I gave that phone number to somebody who's going to ring you." And I was like, "Oh, well, who's going to ring me?" This is all on a WhatsApp. And he goes, "Lucasfilm." And that was the first time I knew. Huh. So I was shocked emoji face. And then Lucasfilm phoned up Pippa Anderson, who's head of post-production at Lucasfilm. And she said, we're going to be working with Gareth and we'd like you to come on. And they, I was not going to be the only editor, obviously. There was another big Hollywood editor on it at that point who unfortunately did not come on board, which was a real shame because I would have loved to have worked with him. And so I came on it really for like 3 months as kind of a trial thing to do the story reel for Gareth, which was a presentation thing we did to Lucasfilm where we made a version of the film. We didn't have a completed screenplay at that point. We just had the story points. Mm-hmm. Each scene was described roughly as to what each scene was. So young Gina, as this girl growing up sees her parents at the time her parents get shot, and goes into hiding, is rescued by Saw Gerrera, that kind of thing. And so I would cut that together with the concept artwork done by the art department at Lucasfilm. which were huge digital paintings. And they would occupy the full frame. And then down this corner here, 1/4 of the screen, would be the movie clip to represent that. So, for instance, I would take Once Upon a Time in the West, Henry Fonda walking through the cornfield to the house, killing everybody. That's Krennic turning up on the, but it wasn't, I didn't just lift that scene entirely. It was shot by shot. So Vader's shuttle comes down from Return of the Jedi, lands on the planet, cut to, the homestead from The Searchers, John Ford, The Searchers, whereby they realize they've got to rush and get out because the Indians are coming. Cut back to Henry Fonda walking through the cornfield. Cut back to the little girl going through the tunnel from Leon, Natalie Portman. Cut to Henry Fonda walking through and so it was all shot by shot basis, and then there was in that previous incantation there was a big chase through the cornfields. So I used Will Smith from Men in Black, not Wild Wild West, when they got them being chased by drones, which I used the drone from Empire Strikes Back going through the snowfield. So it was the whole movie. It was ran 2 hours, and it just had captions. So we had the dialogue from the original scenes, and then captions to explain what was that. So Jin runs through the cornfield pursued by stormtroopers, and it was all a proof of concept. And it took me 2 months to cut that because, as you can imagine, it's a lot of trying to work out where to get a shot from. And the artwork would come in dribs and drabs as well from the concept department. And Gareth watched it and he said it's the most surreal film I've ever seen, but it's perfect. And now want the designers to watch it, the costume designers to watch it, the DOP to watch it, the writer to watch it, because it really informed the balance of action to dialogue. Darkness to light, because I kept trying to put jokes in, because I did a whole spreadsheet. There were no jokes in the original version, and I was very conscious that one of the reasons I loved the original trilogy was the amount of jokes. And I did a spreadsheet. I sat down, and every joke I did a column. Who said the joke, which was usually Han Solo or C-3PO. How funny the joke was on the Cole register of 1 to 5, and then I gave that spreadsheet to, and I just did New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and because that was like a morning's work or something, then I ran it over to the ranch to give it to Gareth and said, look, I think you've got to put jokes in this. He's like, yeah, Gary and I are kind of working on it, and then obviously when Alan Tudyk came in as K2SO, he just improvised a different line of dialogue for every single one of his scenes because it's CGI, and he knew we could. And then he even gave us a load in the ADR session as well. So Alan Tudyk completely brought the humor that is in the finished film into Rogue. I mean, the writers did as well. And Tony did, Gary, everybody, Chris brought their bit in. But I'd like to think I started that ball rolling.
You obviously, go on.
I was going to say, because Gareth was making Apocalypse Now with Rogue, and I was like, I get that, I love that, but also it's Star Wars, a Star Wars film that's going to join straight on the beginning of New Hope.
And I think it's the most Star Wars film since 1980. I think that they absolutely nailed the tone, the look, the structure, everything, the dialogue. I think it really feels to me like this, not just the Star Wars that I know, but the Star Wars that I imagined as a kid, if it was within that universe. I mean, you were a fan beforehand, right? But
yeah, totally. I mean, there are pictures of me on the internet dressed in an X-Wing fighter pilot outfit back from 2007. When Gareth and I were working on Attila, actually, it was the weekend of the Star Wars convention, the first ever Star Wars convention in Europe, I think, certainly in London. And I said, Gareth, we're going, right?
The one out in Docklands, was that?
The one out in Docklands.
Yeah.
As a Jedi for 2 days and went out wear it as a Jedi. Gareth never turned up because it was his birthday that weekend, and same weekend as mine, and he buggered off with his girlfriend, and I went on my own, Billy No Mates. But and then I also Star Wars Uncut. So when they did Empire Strikes Back, I actually submitted a clip. So which I did years before we did Rogue, and it's quite funny because Gareth was pitching to Lucasfilm to let me come on board editorially onto Rogue, and he was like, "Oh, Cole's really good, and we worked together on these films, but also he's taught at the National, he's lectured at the BFI, and he's lectured at BAFTA, and if you go online, you can see him doing a Q&A at BAFTA." And he went online, and the first clip that came up was me in Empire Uncut, just as a no speeder pilot going, I found them. Yeah. Anyway, because I was doing it for a laugh, filming it with a little in my back garden in Scotland. If I'd known Kathy Kennedy was going to be watching it, I would have upped my game.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Then so that was my first process into Rogue, and then they just kept saying to me, oh no, we would stay on, we would come back to the UK and work on the shoot, and so I kind of got in by stealth, I think, and I was there from first to last. I mean, I finished the day before the world premiere. I mean, again, you talked about like deadlines and things. There was a moment when one of the people very high up at Lucasfilm said to me, every time we say we don't think we're going to make it, this could be the one. And I was like, wow, because I wasn't used to working on anything that scale. And obviously we did make it, but it was right up to the wire. I mean, we were still cutting VFX shots in right up to the last day.
Blimey. Yeah, and did you would have referenced the original movies quite a lot. Was there anything about those originals that kind of surprised you in the way that they were constructed or edited?
I'd seen them so many times that nothing actually surprised me in terms of the editing. What was really interesting was on the Avid, I had all the movies. At that point, I had the first 7 films. So 1 to 7, because 7 had just come out. I had all of them with the DME, the dialogue, music, and effects tracks, all separate. And I would nick music as temp, and I would nick effects all the time, sound effects all the time. I was always cutting in shots visually as guide. Need an X-wing? Go find an X-wing. But what shocked me was listening to the music score without the dialogue and the sound effects, because I have this thing whereby if I try and make a music edit work as best as I can, and if I can't, I bury my really bad music edit under a gunshot or a door slam or a syllable of a line of dialogue. And theirs was exactly the same. They're terrible music edits in the original Star Wars films, but they are buried under. And you're like, wow, they didn't do any better job than I did. And I always thought I was, crap at music editing. They're just as bad, but they know they can get away with it. And so that was a real eye-opener. I guess the other thing was how bad some of the special effects on Return of the Jedi are when you watch them frame by frame. So the one when they're on the bridge of the Star Destroyer and the rebel ship suicide kamikaze pilots in, you can see, when you go through it frame by frame, you can actually see the ram coming through the window and the actors jumping onto the mattress, and you can see the green screen behind it, just a black tarpaulin. If you go frame by frame, it's all there.
Yeah.
It ain't been cleaned up in the digital. It's
really,
like,
there's so many things they missed in that sort of. Yeah,
it's like redo all sorts of other things, and it's interesting because I'd never spotted them before. But when I'm going through it frame by frame, because I was trying to synchronize with an explosion, you're like, oh my god, that's terrible.
And seeing those things and hearing those things in isolation is very different to hearing the mix.
They're terrible. What I'm saying is they're not to the standard that we expect that they are.
Yeah.
What they are to the standard they're needed to be to fool the audience.
Yes.
And that's the trick. And that is the trick that you have to learn. No matter what your budget, you can pull the wool over people's eyes. And as Gareth says, if people are going through a film frame by frame, it's less true now because of streaming, but certainly when we work together, the only way they can do that is if they bought the Blu-ray or they've, paid to see it multiple times in the cinema, at which point you've made your money. Analyzing it level, they're a fan and you've made your money. Your general audience, 99% of the population, they're not spotting it. Why spend more money? That means you get another person back in the cinema to pay for that additional VFX work or sound.
Yeah. It's that sleight of hand, isn't it? And understanding what the audience can and can't sort of discern, really. And that's the thing about the original movie Star Wars in 77, that, you look back at it now and there are some pretty fast cuts in there, particularly in that battle sequence where they cut from pilot to pilot to pilot. Really fast. And
especially on the, even in the corridor scene, the very first Tantive 4 corridor scene, the explosions in they're really quick cuts. Really quick. I mean, people have this misnomer that fast editing is modern. You go watch San Francisco with Clark Gable 1933 and you watch fast cutting in that film. And didn't cut that fast even today. Even Michael Bay would struggle to cut as fast as some of the cuts in San Francisco.
I think the worst example of over editing I've ever seen, I think it's that scene in, I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen the clip in Taken 3. Liam Neeson is jumping a fence and there's something like 19 cuts as he's jumping this fence. It's just like they seem to have done some sum in their head that, you know, action equals more editing,
Right.
which, as we both know, is
completely
rubbish.
untrue.
Yeah.
Go watch Singing in the Rain.
When you did Rogue One, though, and you know, obviously you're working alongside other editors, but you're responsible for making a Star Wars movie, right? It needs to feel like Star Wars in every aspect. So you've got the acting, you've got the costumes, you've got the set design and everything else. And when it comes to the editing, you've got to make it feel like a Star Wars movie, but at the same time, make it contemporary, make it exciting for the current audience. Was that a challenge?
No, and I'll explain why. I'm just going to go back. I'm going to answer that question, but while it's in my head, I'll tell you the story as well. So I was obviously on that movie for like two and a half. I think it was 27 months, so 2 and a bit years. And after we'd been on it, I don't know, 6 months or something, I was in a meeting with Gareth and the art department, and we were watching because I then went on to cut the previews before we started shooting. Which is where you do like a computer game version of the film at the kind of quality of a PS4 game. It's really high quality. And it was the scene when they're attacking Edu. The X-Wings are coming in and shooting up the Imperial turrets. And the question was from art department, do you want these turrets square or round? And Gareth said, I want them round. And I went, no, you can't do that. The Imperial turrets are square, Rebel turrets around. We all know this, right? And Gareth was like, oh, you know, hi, everybody, this is Carl. And I said, listen, mate, you write the letters to all the fans that complain, because I'm not taking responsibility if you put a round turret on an Imperial base. And in the finished film, there are square turrets. I like to think that I was keeping my eye on the ball as to, and obviously there are loads of people on that movie in art department, etc., who worked, like, you know, Doug Chang, you know, our leader in the art department, you know, the absolute god of those things. You know, Doug knows one from the other, but they were giving Gareth his choices as a director. And, you know, and I like to think that if I hadn't talked him out of it, they might have. But anyway, so people were aware and people brought with them, you know, the look of those earlier films in terms, and there were certain things. I mean, at one point we were so desperate to get time out of Rogue. It was, you know, it was long. We were trying to get time out of it, and there would have been this very long scene going through the Rebel base, which ended up on R2D2 C3PO as the X-Wings were all taking off in the background, and half the scene went because it was no longer relevant to the story. And then it was like, and Kathy said, I'll just lose the rest of that tracking shot. And I sort of stopped the Avid and went, oh, no, that's the only time we've got R2 and C3PO in the film. And trust me, the fans will love that moment. I love that moment as a fan. And, you know, and Ali, the other producer, she said, oh, I'll just cut it out, sweetie, cookie, just cut it. And then Kathy went, oh no, we should listen to Cole on this. And so she, no, keep it in. So again, it was that sort of thing whereby, you know, Gareth was desperate to put them in. We'd put them in, you know what I mean? And then it's a case of explaining the reason why, because it is very easy to forget those things. You know, because when you're focusing on you listen to every line of dialogue, is this relevant? Can we lose it? Can we lose time? You do start cutting stuff out. I mean, at one point, we actually cut out the middle act. We actually tried to cut out the whole of Edu because plot-wise, you didn't need it. And we screened it for Kathy without that in. And she said, you know, it actually does work. But I tell you what you miss. You miss the first time they ever come together as a group. Like they're fighting as to try and achieve the same goal, and therefore the only time you'll then get that is, yeah, and this is, and we were like, oh, she's right, damn, we're gonna have to put 20 minutes back in because it was our one cut to take 20 minutes out of the film. So it's very easy in the heat of the battle to lose focus on something that has actually got a bigger underpinning, be it in 20 minutes or be it a single shot of R2C3PO.
But sometimes you have to be brutal like that to realise that you need it, don't you? You take it away to realise what's missing.
That's absolutely right. And what we did do was we then realized we could crunch it right down, because we realized it was only about them coming together. We could then plot, go, 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 go. We could chuck out slightly, like you say, go very, very bold. It's what Gareth calls bend it till you've broken it, you know, and then you can put it back in. So break it, then refix it. What you don't want to do is break it at the world premiere.
Yeah.
It's too late then.
Yeah.
Which is what a lot of filmmakers clearly do. A lot of people break things and they don't realize it until it's gone out into the wider audience. And then the other reason is you were talking about, was it difficult editorially? It wasn't, because as you rightly point out, the editing in New Hope, the editing in Empire, it's very contemporary even today. I know audiences find those films slow now. If you watch those films with younger children or child audiences, very, very, very young audiences, like 7, 8, 9, and 1. And that's the reality, because 7, 8, and 9 are fast and 1's got a kid in it. And when you're 5 years old, that's all they see. So, you know, that's kind of where we're at with that.
Yeah, my daughter, who would have been about 9 when I think I showed her Star Wars, one of my daughters, who let me show her Star Wars. The others were like, I'm not interested. She said, that bit in the desert with the robots, it goes on for like an hour and a half. You know, that's how she perceived that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely. It's very rare to have a child under the age of 11 watch any of the original Star Wars films for the first time and enjoy the pacing. You know, they just think they're slow and boring. So it's interesting. And you have to remember, these were children's films that just take over the entire universe.
Yeah. And, you know, I think another thing about those movies as well, and the style in which they were created, we mustn't forget as well, it's bloody hard to pull those films off, you know, and it's not their fault that we get this slew of other films trying to copy them that don't meet those, right, that same sort of height. But
yes,
I can still watch them and I can still enjoy them from so many different aspects. You know, as a kid, I enjoyed them as movies. As an adult, the behind the scenes stuff,
craft,
you know, the craft of it, the artistry of it, and now talking to people about them as well.
Yeah. So I'd say the biggest editorial thing that I was disappointed about was when I cut the story reel, and when I cut the previs, I put in wipes and, you know, fades to black and also everything that's in the original New Hope. I know Gareth certainly, and I don't know if it was Gareth and Kathy, I don't know who made, but it was basically, they were like, we're not going to do that. We want it to look we want it to look standalone anthology. We want it to look different. We don't want an opening crawler. I put an opening roller on. We don't want an opening crawler, and we don't want any wipes. And it's interesting because Mandalorian still has wipes and everything. And so I was like, it's the only film that doesn't. And I'm like, I wish that had been a policy that had either been stuck with. So they'd said, look, that's it. Only Georgie's 6 movies are going to have them, you know, or they're all going to have them. I think the fact that we weren't allowed to do them on Rogue, but everybody else has been allowed to use them, I think is a shame, because it took away one of the colors from our palette that would have made it feel like a Star Wars film.
Yeah, I found it initially a little jarring to have that, the lack of that, and also the text telling you where you were, kind of thing. I found that, well, this is not Star Warsy. But then, you know, I'm able to kind of define that film in my head as this kind of standalone thing, which is ultimately what they were trying to achieve, I guess. So
that's exactly right, and that was a lot of Tony brought that to it as well. Tony brought that standalone eye to it, because he didn't come in with the inherited legacy that we all did. He came in with a fresh eye, and his brother John, who came on as the final editor, you know, he brought in his American, you know, style of editing, and that brilliant way that he would intercut scenes much more than I ever had. When I cut the beach scene originally, it was a one-er. It was a single scene. And then Tony came in and said, hey, John's found a way to intercut that with the Vader stuff. And I was like, oh my God. And he was, yeah, but Finkley's found a way to blend it all with music. And I watched it. I was like, oh my God, it works. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. But I'd had that as a single continuous, you know, dying on the beach scene.
It is actually the only Star Wars film that brought me to tears.
Right, interesting.
Yeah, the bit with Jin and her father in the hologram. I think it's something to do with being a father and having daughters, and maybe it's what you bring to it, isn't it? Ultimately.
Right, right. I'd say what was interesting about that scene when I first cut it the very first time, um, which was way like a year, almost 10 months before he was actually brought on. I actually cut that with the score from Lost by Michael Giacchino, and it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful, that scene on the beach with that music. And then I was assuming we were going to have John Williams or Alexander or whoever. Do you know what I mean? And then it was funny. It was ironic that it was, and the piece of music he wrote for that is just sublime. And that's what also makes it work. That's what I tell you what, Jamie. I think that the person who made the biggest contribution in post to Rogue One feeling like a Star Wars movie was Michael's score, because it was modern, but it was legacy.
Yes, yeah.
The blend was perfection.
Yeah, he had a toe in both camps, didn't he? There definitely, and that last scene is really, that gets me too. It's properly gut wrenching, and I think it's also, as a kid, I always wanted to live in that universe. It was always so complete,
Right.
and Rogue One really felt like they were people living in that universe as well. Whereas I think the later movies for me never really achieved that.
Right.
So what have you been working on recently? What's next for us to look out from your your wonderful editing, your wonderful work?
Okay, so the next film that will hit the public's eyes is at the end of next week. The Alan Moore, Mitch Jenkins film, The Show, hits screens. It's released at 500 screens in America, and which for an art house movie is not bad. And it's at the London Fright Fest Film Festival. That was a film that we edited in 2018, 2019, and was due to premiere in 2020 at South by Southwest, but because it got cancelled because of COVID, it completely fell away from distribution, and it's now finally coming out. And that is, for people that don't know, Alan Moore is the graphic novelist who wrote V for Vendetta, From Hell, and Watchmen, amongst many other graphic novels. And this is the first screenplay that he has written for the screen as a feature. He wrote a series of short films back in 2012 through 2014, which were 3 short films which were cut together and released as a feature on the art house circuit, which was called Showpieces. And I edited those. I edited 2 of the 3. And then they asked me to do the feature. That stars Tom Burke. It's Get Carter meets H.P. Lovecraft. So it's a noir detective story in a surreal world. And for people who have not seen the shorts, if you can seek them out and watch them before the main movie, it will give you all the backstory to the characters. It's basically like watching episodes 1, 2, and 3 before watching episode 4, New Hope. It does give you the backstory. You can watch the show without having seen the short films, and all the plot points that are in those 3 films are in the feature. So there's back reference to them. It's just it's imparted as information, whereas you actually get to see the horrors of what the people have been through before. Because the Showpieces is very adult and very dark. The Show is a little less dark, a little less adult, but it's still, think Ben Kingsley in Sexy Beast. It's that level of language.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a film to take your granny to. It is absolutely not. I'm extremely proud of my editing on that. It's Mitch Jenkins is the director, and it's a Mitch Jenkins Alan Moore film, and it's very stylistic. Made very low budget, BFI funded.
What's great about your job, I think, and in talking to you, it sort of came to me just then, is that you kind of get the opportunity to become an expert at so many different things, different subjects. You've got your Star Wars, you've got your kind of low budget stuff, you've got your art house stuff, and documentary as well. I mean, I watched that Funny You Never Knew that you edited about George Gobel, Imogene Coca, and Martha Raye, who are comedians I didn't know anything about. It's full of an absolute ton of archival footage, and you create this wonderful story about these people. You end up kind of falling in love with them in a way, these characters that you never knew. Do you find that an interesting part of your job, sort of having to become a temporary expert at something?
Love it.
Yeah.
And that's why I've always loved flicking between documentaries and drama. I've always loved that because you learn so much. I mean, I did this Channel 4 series about the First World War, and I knew a lot about the First World War, but I learned what I knew the Western story of the First World War. What I learned doing that series was it's a world war, not a European war. So I learned about the fighting between, which I knew a little bit from Gallipoli, but really about the Turkish, because it was told from the Turkish side. When I worked on it, I was always telling the story, or we were on our episodes, from the German side and from the Turkish side, which was stuff I didn't know. I knew it from the British side or the Australian side, New Zealand side. So that was fascinating. Funny you never knew, and I'm really glad you liked it. That was an absolute labor of love, that film. The director has been working on that movie. He did about 6 years of his life on that, 7 years of his life on that film. Andrew Hunt. So in the end, he did so much work. Like, he did all the archive research. He did all the onlining. He did we've got to share the editor's credit, because I didn't have time to watch the hundreds of hours of TV, of the TV episodes. He would watch every single episode of all of their shows. And then I say to him, what's a funny Martha Ray skit? And he'd go, okay, my favorite ones are this one, this one, and this. And then I'd watch those. And then I'd go, okay, of those 10, I like this one and this one. But he would have watched hundreds of them. So it's like, we have to share the editing credit, because you've done, in the old days, what I would have done, which is watch everything. And on this, I haven't watched everything. I've made editorial choices based on yours. And also what he'd do, if he'd put together the dialogue, the sound bites from the interviewees with the clips that he thought best represented them, send them to me on a very long timeline. And then I would cut those down to 2 minutes, and then on to the next one. So he was doing like the first assembly cut. Then I was just fine cutting it. And then at the end, when I'd finished it, we'd kind of picture locked it. He was then pressured by the producers to take even more out. So he went in and go, I'm sorry, I've taken out 10 seconds out of Goebel. Can you look at it? And I'd go, okay, is a better 10 seconds to come out? Or I tell you what, I can get another 10 seconds out if you want, mate. So I'd even fine cut it even beyond that. Do you know what I mean? So that was a great collaboration. And I've always tried to alternate, because I just think it's really interesting when you do both. And also, I genuinely believe that your work as an editor these days, on a drama, you're asked to cut films like a documentary, like it's real. And when you're working on documentaries, you're asked to make them look like dramas and big feature films with Hollywood scores and tracking shots and drone shots. So I think the two things, there is only now an editor. And I've always believed that. I've done that in the last 40 years of my career. I've flicked constantly between docs and drama. There is a difference, but effectively there is no difference. There is a difference, but the skill set is the same. And it is a blindness in production and producers who will only hire people who've worked on dramas to work on dramas, and only hire people who've cut that kind of documentary to work on that kind of documentary. And they are idiots for doing it, because they are limiting their talent base that they can hire, and they are limiting the skill set and the passion that people will bring to those. It's
like the editor's version of what actors do, where they'll do a feature and they'll do a theatre, because the two kind of cross-pollinate each other, and you know, it's where you learn your craft, isn't it, by doing different things.
Think of actors who get typecast as only rom-coms, and suddenly, you know, Ryan Reynolds will go off and not do a rom-com, and suddenly he's Deadpool. Suddenly he's the next action man. You know, it's we want you to have cut this exact film before, but we want it cut different, because we only feel safe hiring people that can do that, and it's nonsense.
Yeah, there is that sort of pigeonholing that happens all across the industry, isn't there? You were talking earlier about how, you know, you'll choose the tool that's right for the job. Now, given that everybody these days with a phone or with an iPad pretty much has a full, you know, film suite available to them, they can shoot, they can edit, they can export. What do you think? You know, because everybody thinks they're an editor, right? They're not.
Yeah.
What do you think are the missing ingredients that people need to learn to elevate their editing? Because we can all go, oh, that shot works next to that shot, chop. But then what is it over and above that makes a good editor? What do people need to learn to elevate their editing skills?
Storytelling,
Mm.
and you don't need to be cutting visuals to do that. You need to be reading. You can read books. However, books about storytelling is what I'm saying by that. However, I genuinely believe that the biggest tool educationally that I've had is to constantly be watching films. And I mean constantly. I will put in a 14-hour day in an edit suite and I'll go and watch a movie afterwards. And if you're not doing that, you are removing the most important tool that you've got, which is to watch other people's work. Because even a bad film, you should learn what made it bad. Why didn't it work? What would you have done to that differently? And when I was a student, even a roll of Super 8 film to buy and color process, which lasted 2.5 minutes, was a week's wages for me working full time in a factory. 20 quid. I used to earn 50p an hour, before tax. So I couldn't afford to go out and shoot loads of stuff that I could do now on an iPhone. I used to take Hollywood movies, record them onto a VHS tape, and then I would put them in the edit suite and I would cut them down and I would see how much time I could take out of a Hollywood movie and see if I could keep the story threads, because that was the only way I had of doing long form. In terms of these days, you don't have to go to that extreme, but you can. It's even easier now to rip a movie, stick it into Avid and cut it down. So I think there's that. First of all, story. I think technically, if I was trying to progress my career and I was a younger editor, I'd learn After Effects. No question. I think After Effects is probably the most important thing that you could learn in terms of making yourself employable against the rest of the crowd.
That's kind of expected these days, isn't it? For editors to come in and have VFX experience, After Effects experience, because you can, even if you are not finishing something to the level it's going to end up at least you can give an impression of what's going to be there.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, so I would definitely say to use to learn how to do After Effects to do that. If you don't have access to that, and you've got an Avid, I would definitely be learning all the effects, the animat tools and things in Avid. I did loads of temp VFX on the Avid in Rogue. Like everything I turned over had my temp version of it. Even if I was literally just comping in, a Star Wars Stormtrooper toy that I've got here that I'd film against a cutting room wall and comp it in, I was constantly doing that. That's the other thing I do in my films that we haven't really discussed actually, is I'll always go out and shoot stuff that I think the film needs, even if it's just with my assistant walking down the road to do stuff that I want them to go out and do with the main cast. I was filming Rob Seeley, my assistant on Rogue. I'd film him in the corridor in the edit suite on my iPhone, acting out the Krennic part, and then I'd send it to Pinewood and I'd say, can you get Mads to do this? Because I want that. But and on the lower budget films, I'll sometimes just go out and shoot it and it will be in the finished film. But loads of times I'll make stuff up as just mocks with captions. I'll do it with really crappy drawings or things I've got off the internet, or I'll go and shoot it on my iPhone and cut it in, get a proof of concept that works story-wise, show it to the director, get them on side, get them to push it to the producers, get the money to go and do it properly.
Yeah, because verbally it's not going to happen, but if you do it visually, then because that's the other thing, isn't it? Is trying to communicate, finding the best way to communicate your ideas, because there are people in the industry who aren't creative, in terms of their job title, let's say, who find it very difficult to visualize things.
Yeah,
and they're the people ultimately who are going to write the budget,
yeah,
and approve it. So yeah.
In terms of other things I've done recently, so I did To Olivia, which was the biopic about Patricia O'Neill and Roald Dahl, the author, which is on Sky Movies now. It was going to be a theatric release, but unfortunately all the cinemas were closed, so it was screened on Sky because they were going to do a simultaneous release. That's was a very low budget film. It's Hugh Bonneville plays the part of Roald Dahl. Keely Hawes plays Patricia. That was an absolute joy to work on that. It was 90 minutes long. John Hay, the director, first time we'd ever worked together. I got the job because of a first assistant director that I knew who'd worked on the show. Actually, David recommended me to John. I did a Skype interview, Zoom interview, got the gig during that interview. 2 weeks later, I was on set, day one filming. Normally I'm on a film 2 years, 3 years before it's even shot, because I'll come in at script stage.
And do you like to go on set, like on a film like that? Yeah,
as possible.
Yeah.
I think people who don't do that are again removing another tool, and the tool is twofold. Firstly, how do you learn? And secondly, how do you get the crew to know who you are and what your contribution is? So if I go on set and I talk, and the thing that I absolutely do, even if I don't get onto set, I'll try and make a point of seeing the crew of an evening when they've wrapped, because they usually end up in a bar somewhere. You can find them, hotel bar or somewhere. And what's really good about that is, very good thing you can do as an editor is please tell the rest of the crew and the cast when it's going well, which is 99% of the time. You know, you say, oh, saw today's rushes, look fantastic, love the costumes, you know, love the makeup, I'm loving the lighting, you know, oh, the sound's really good, I can hear clearly, thank you for getting that wild track for me. Give that positive feedback. Then when you go on set, because it's not good and you want them to reshoot it, that's not the first time they've met you. Because if that's the first time they've met you, they're probably going to say, bugger off.
Yeah.
Right? Rightly, who are you? I don't know you. What do you mean it's not good enough? You know,
it's about creating relationships. Yeah.
In very, you know, proactively complimentary when it's all good. When you turn and say, guys, I'm so sorry, just today's sound just wasn't, you know, I can't read. Can we ADR that, or can we do a wild track for that? Or can we reshoot it? Or, you know, to the DOP, I'd really love to come and look at this because it's not as good as the rest of the stuff. And I really want to make sure that you're happy with this. You know, costume, you know, today's costumes are just not blending into the backgrounds the way that I know you've done that very deliberately. And now the browns are not matching to the brown backgrounds. Suddenly it's zinging out. And, you know, we could adjust this in the grade, but do you want to do that? Or do you think maybe we should adjust the costume, you know, while we've still got time if we get to the big scene with her wearing that next week? You know, these are all conversations that you should have with your other HODs and the creatives. A team effort. It's not a team of one.
Yeah. And yeah, you're not just an editor. You are branching across all those different departments that you have to deal with. So creating relationships is really important.
And also, you're the first audience who's seen what was captured on the lens. They might stand on set and the lighting might look good on set. The costume might look good on set and the sound might have been good to their ears on set. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is what's on the rushes. And when you look at it and you go, that's not coming across on that screen, that's their first time they're going to get that feedback.
I've heard some editors say that the experience of being on set contaminates, in a way, that first audience reaction you have as an editor. And I know some prefer to go nowhere near a set because they want to have that kind of freshness. But ultimately, I guess it's whatever works for you.
I can just erase all that. I will stand there and I'll stand with them for 4 hours in the rain, watching them get that crane shot, and the next day I'll cut it out. I don't care. I was there. I was cold. I was wet. I wanted to go home. You got shot. Don't fit in the film. Gone. No, I don't put it in just because, you know, because I've been there. On to Olivia, I directed loads of second unit stuff on that, of the cars driving through the forest on his way to the first reading, because John asked me, you know, so, can you go out and shoot second unit? Because there was a load of stuff I wanted to pick up. So all the close-ups, there's lots of close-ups of rolling his silver ball and with his pen writing in the book. And first unit hadn't had time to shoot any of it. I was wanting it. John, you know, was listening to my broken record every day and said, oh, well, just get a unit and go out and do it. Oh, well, you got a unit, go and shoot the opening title sequence driving through the forest. So I was out in the rain, in the forest, at night with a unit. They were amazing, my second unit. Steve, my cameraman, was fantastic. And under very arduous circumstances. And that was in the film until the last day of the edit. And on the last day of the edit, when we'd locked the film, and my assistant was doing turnovers, I thought, you know what? I want to give this one more go. And so what I did was I thought it would be better if we had an opening title sequence a la Saul Bass, giving the backstory of Patricia and Roald. And I went online and I downloaded a load of clip art, and then I animated a sequence that lasted 2.5 minutes that carried our opening titles, and it told the story of Roald growing up at school, being a naughty boy, going off to Africa, crashing his plane in the desert, then being shot down during the war, Keely being an actress growing up on a farm, going to Broadway, winning an Emmy, going a Tony, then going off and starring in Breakfast at Tiffany's. I was very keen to get the line Klaatu Baradu Niktu in, because it's a line in the film, and if you don't know the movie that it's from, The Day the Earth Stood Still, then you're thinking, what's this kid talking about? So I wanted to get that in. So I did all this stuff, animated it all. Oh, and the fact she had an affair with Gary Cooper. So I did that all. Phoned the director, who lived 5-minute bike right away. I said, John, just come and have a look at this, would you? He came in, he watched it, he loved it. And all that stuff that I'd shot in the rain, in the forest, in the night went. all replaced with this title sequence that we then got Matt Ingram to go off and do it properly, beautifully animated Soul Bass title sequence.
That's brilliant. Well, now people know that you're willing to even, remove things that you've spent your time doing. They're going to give you that more respect, aren't they? And
whenever I shoot any, because I'm always shooting second unit stuff. Whenever I look at any of my second unit stuff, when the editor looks at my directings, I'm like, he's so crap. That's an awful shot. What was he thinking? Why did he do that? That's terrible. And it's me talking to myself.
It's funny though, isn't it, that there is a sort of tendency in film to kind of forget about those little insert shots. Oh, we'll do those later, but sometimes they're so important. I heard Roger Deakins talking about this on his podcast a few weeks ago about, he would want to go and do the insert shots, and then no, we'll let the second unit do that. And it's like, no, that's really important. We need to see his hands caress this item or whatever it is.
And normally I'm much happier if the first unit goes off and shoots it. I tend to send them my version, it cut within the sequence, so they get the right timing and the frame size and everything. But I'd much rather a proper director went off and did it, because usually I'm on set when I should be in the editing. And I'm like, which is a great time for my assistant usually, because I'm like, I'm on set all day, you got to cut yesterday's rushes. So like Chris was busy cutting the Paul Newman scene while I was out directing cars and close-ups of silver balls. I think Roger's right to think it's important, and it is important. Obviously, cost-wise, on most of the films that I do, it has to be second unit.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm aware that we've talked for a couple of hours now, Colin.
Yeah, I knew we would.
I knew we would.
Okay, you are.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to talk, definitely.
I'll tell you what I'll do. Hold on, I'm just going to refill my glass.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So, I've just been editing a movie last year and the beginning of this year called Prisoners of Paradise, which is a period drama. Again, it's by Mitch Jenkins, who directed Showpieces and The Show. It's our third film collaboration, and that's a period drama set in 1920s Mauritius. It was all shot on location, all shot during the whole of lockdown, because Mauritius at the time had no COVID, and the crew flew in, did their quarantine and daily tests, and then they were all allowed no masks, nothing. So I think we were the only film shooting in the world at the time when we filmed that. And that's been interesting, because I refused to go because I'm old and vulnerable. And at the time I had not had any vaccines. I asked my assistants, did anyone want to go and anyone want to stay? And one of my assistants said he did definitely not want to go. So he stayed in London. And the other assistant said, I definitely want to go. I definitely go. And then he paused and he said, I'm going to ask my girlfriend, and if she says yes, I will definitely want to go. So she said yes, and then he flew out for a couple of months. And so he was sitting in the edit suite in Mauritius with the director every day, and I would be on a Zoom call, and I would talk to the director as we would all watch rushes together. And then I'd do the cuts and send the cuts over. Just as an Avid bin, he would just relink it to the media. It would all come up, and he'd show it to the director. So that will be... I think because of the way everything's going, it's currently in post, so it's in sound mixing now. We recorded the score at Abbey Road, and I think we were the first score to be recorded at Abbey Road with the entire orchestra all in situ at once. Because when we recorded to Olivia last year, we had to do that with the wind section one day and the brass section another day because of the social distancing required amongst the musicians. So Prisoners, Sturdivant Adams is our composer. It's an absolutely beautiful, full-on Hollywood John Williams type score. I think actually Sturdy's got the same agent as John, I think. Anyway, but he's brilliant. He's new. I discovered him I was fortunate enough to hear some of his music and meet him when I was in LA and San Francisco in 2019. It's one of those things, people tell you they're a composer, we've all heard it, and you listen to their stuff and you think, okay. And I listened to Sturdy's stuff and I thought, okay. First chance I got, I recommended him. He had to do a pitch along with another composer. The director preferred, I was out of that loop, but the director picked the music. And interestingly, the producer at one point, quite late in the day, said, I said, no, you've got your temp track over it, because I obviously temped it with everybody, all the usual suspects, Danny Elfman and, everybody. And he said, I just love that piece of music that's at the waterfall. And I was like, yeah, that's Sturdy's temp. That is our composer's that he wrote as an audition piece. So, you know, and that was on a synth. That wasn't even a full orchestra like the rest of them. So it was such a beautiful melody, you know, because I'm always about melody these days. I'm like, so many scores. I used to come out of the cinema and I used to hum the Indiana Jones theme, the Raiders March, you know, and the Star Wars thing. And I don't do that anymore coming out of a movie. I just don't. No matter how much people say to me, oh, this is old school, I don't hear the music.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
you can't hum a Hans Zimmer.
You just can't do it. And yesterday it was interesting. Somebody gave me a birthday present, and it was the plane that flies in at the beginning of Where Eagles Dare. It was a model of that plane they'd built, and because they know I love that movie, and I took a picture of it against the mountain outside my house, and I sent it to a friend, and I said, and now you can't get the music out of your head, can you? And they said, no, I'm already hearing that Ron Goodwin score in my head. It's that iconic. And I don't know where the iconic scores are now, you know, because everything is a bit, it does nothing.
Yeah.
It fits the picture for the duration. It's like a McDonald's burger. It does it at the time.
Does the
5
job.
minutes later, you're hungry.
Yeah.
And I'm not going out, rushing out to buy. Michael's about the only person these days that I tend to do that with. You know, I will buy a Michael, you know, Giacchino score. And there's very few.
Yeah,
you know?
I can't think the last time I bought a score, actually.
Right. Michael's is the last stuff I would have bought. And the last theme I can think of in contemporary times where you can hum a few bars is the Avengers theme. And that's because it's Alan Silvestri, who's an 80s composer.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Debbie's
score for Olivia was absolutely beautiful.
Mm.
But I don't hum it. But I certainly, what was lovely actually, the other thing about doing the opening title animated sequence was I tested it with about 6 different types of music, like a jazz score, a Hollywood score, you know, a Danny Elfman kind of Edward Scissorhands score. And then Debbie, our composer, said, you know what, I want the theme that I've written for the film for later on, I want to introduce that now over this new title sequence. So she completely rescored the opening with the theme because she had the opportunity to do so. And that's the other thing that I'm quite passionate about that, again, modern films don't have, and that's title sequences. The putting the titles at the end was the death of the good title sequence. Obviously, Star Wars was the first film to do it. And now everybody does. And Star Wars did it for a reason. There was a reason George did that. And it's not a valid reason why everything now does it. And the only films that have retained opening title sequences pretty much is the James Bond franchise. And what's brilliant is it gives you the opportunity for 3.5 minutes to set up what's going to follow. It gets your audience in the mood. So long as you can have a pre-title sequence if you like Bonds do, but so long as you have that opening title sequence, because you set up the flavor, you can set up the musical themes, you can set up the vibe. Like you look at Catch Me If You Can, that title sequence. It's Tintin, the Tintin movie, you know, both scored obviously by John Williams. They totally set up those films.
Yeah. Well, I spoke to Dan Perry, who's a titles designer for a previous episode of this podcast, and he did, you know, films like Raising Arizona, After Hours, Airplane. Well, he did Star Wars as well. Taxi Driver, which, you know, is just incredible. Just the way that sets the tone with that Bernard Herrmann score is just like
that Herrmann score if that's a different movie.
It's just like, fuck, something terrible is going to happen. Like, you know, at some point something terrible is going to happen.
Right.
And you know, he did Nashville as well, which, you know, it's just wonderful, wonderful work. And he sees those as kind of little independent movies that do their job, which is what we just described, you know, to set that tone and to sort of lay the ground for what's to come.
Absolutely. And there are two things that give you an opportunity to do that with your audience, to set the tone. The first is your score. You know, your score / title sequence, right? And the second one is your movie poster. And 90% of movie posters these days, to me, look like perfume adverts. You know, I'm sorry, but Daniel Craig standing there in a tuxedo against the black background does nothing. Sean Connery walking around in a tuxedo around the rim of a volcano with a rocket in it, at an impossible angle that can only exist as a painting, not as a photograph. tells me what that movie is. It sets my frame of mind. It tells me I'm going to go and see a Roald Dahl scripted, insane James Bond film before I've stepped through the door.
Yeah.
So when that stuff starts, so when a giant rocket swallows another rocket in the opening, I'm there. I'm there because I knew from that poster outside the cinema I was going to get something like that. I'm not going, oh, well, that wasn't what was advertised. That's exactly what was advertised.
Yeah, and when I was speaking to Dan Perry, I think Spielberg brought him on very early for Close Encounters, and he designed the Close Encounters, logo type essentially. And that poster with the road and the light in the distance, it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen in the film, but it draws you in. Yeah. And it gives you the vibe.
I'm sure you've seen it, Jamie, but that was the original trailer for Close Encounters, was a camera tracking down the road. That poster, that icon poster, was made in 3D, and the camera just tracks to. There were no, these days they would mothership.
Yeah, it'd be the first thing you see.
It would land, and then ET would get out and do this. Extraterrestrial would do it. Would do it. In the trailer.
Yeah.
If they were making that trailer today. And what they did with Close Encounters trailer was made a trailer that made me want to pre-book that ticket back when people were pre-booked for opening day.
What do you think of trailers, actually, while you mentioned that subject? Because
too long and give away far too much.
Yes, good. I'm glad you said that, because I totally agree.
Think stop everything with a tease trailer and you're there.
Isn't it born out of the concern from the studio that they're not going to have communicated enough to people to draw them in? Like, they have to show them.
Yeah. And I think it actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah, agreed.
It weakens the film. So when they come out of the film, they haven't seen anything new because they've seen it in the trailer. So they actually come out with a lower rating than they would have going into that movie. And secondly, they make people not want to go and see the film because they feel they've seen the whole film.
Yeah, I say that a lot. I turn to my wife and I say, I don't need to see that. Yeah.
You've seen it, right? And it's interesting. The other day, I watched a film I knew nothing about called Shadows in the Cloud, which is a horror film on, I think it's either Netflix or Amazon Prime. I think it might be Amazon Prime. It's got Chloe Moritz from Kick-Ass. And all I knew was she's a pilot or a passenger on a B-17 during the war. And something's trying to rip the plane apart. Now, I'm instantly interested because, as you know, Roald Dahl wrote the original Gremlins for Walt Disney, which was never then filmed, but they made the book of it. And so clearly it was basically Roald Dahl's Gremlins. I watched the film and then I watched the trailer. And then I texted all my friends and said, you may or may not enjoy this film. It's a Marmite film. Some people will love it. Some people will hate it. Whatever you do, under no circumstances, watch the trailer. Because it will ruin everything. Everything about that film is ruined in the trailer. We did have a moment when we were cutting Rogue, and the trailer guy came in, and I was sitting there with various high ups in the Lucasfilm world and the Disney world, and we were watching that, and we used to have a layer on the Avid that we would not turn on depending on who was in the room. Because the secrecy was so great that even the inner circle, you had to be in the inner circle to watch that cut played out on the top layer. Now, the top layer was obviously Tarkin and Leia. And the Tarkin shot, we were screening it with top layer on. And this person went, oh my God, we should put that in the trailer. And my heart sank.
Yeah.
Because I know I'm not anywhere near high enough up that pyramid to say no to that. But fortunately, the other sane voices in the room went, no, you cannot have that.
Can you imagine?
Because they would have put everything in. And it's just like, seriously, it's a Star Wars film.
Yeah.
The audience is there without a trailer.
Yeah. This is true.
You have the minimum trailer to get people in.
And now all you get with that Rogue One trailer is, why isn't that shot in the final movie? That bit looks different, blah, blah, blah.
They literally, the trailer department made shots up for that film, for that trailer. So the TIE fighter was never, ever in the film. Ever. That was a trailer. Like we also, it was me, Gareth, Jabez was there. I think it was before John Gilroy came on. Kathy was there. Ali was there. We watched that trailer and we all went, what's that TIE fighter shot? Is that staying? Is that staying? So yeah. But it's interesting in a way, isn't it? Because then it's a good thing because you've kind of double bluffed. You know? And obviously all trailers are made before the film is finished. So, and you're cutting stuff out right up to the last minute on a big movie. The only trailers that get made after the movie are like low budget indie films because they're made after. There's not the time to make them during. And also there's a huge window between lock and release on an indie movie versus a studio film when you're finishing it the day before it's going into 3,000 screens. So yeah, I just think less is more on trailers. Like a lot less is a lot more.
Yeah, I've got a friend who, I think it must have been for Force Awakens, he avoided all the trailers. We went to see it in Leicester Square. He avoided all the posters. He was like this in the foyer. He was just walking through with his head down, eyes covered. It was like leading a blind man into a Star Wars movie.
That's kind of like how I did with Black Widow, which was the first film I saw back at the cinema after COVID, after lockdown, and I had not seen and I'd got a lot of friends who'd worked on that movie. I could have, found out the entire story if I'd needed to. And I was like, don't tell me anything. Even on WhatsApp groups, I was like, I'm leaving this conversation right now. Don't say anything to spoil the film. Don't spoil stuff.
You saw that on your birthday visit, didn't you, Dan, into London?
I did, that's right. It was that day. It was afternoon. I saw you. We'd all been to, myself, Matt and Paul had been to the Odeon Leicester Square to see that.
I always like to do this. As a decision I made some years ago, that if I hear good things about people that I think they may not have heard, then I tell them. And that evening, Colin, I have to say, everybody I spoke to was just saying, oh God, he's such a good editor, Colin. He's such a good editor. They were all drunk. That's
all I can tell you.
This was early on. Yeah. No, but every person individually was just saying what a great guy you are and what a great editor you are. So, you're clearly doing something right, mate.
Bless them. In terms of posters, I know I started off with that there was a whole reason why I wanted to, which was the poster for Jungle Cruise. Made me want to see that movie.
Yeah, because it looked like an old-fashioned.
I don't care if that movie's any good or not. I'm buying that ticket based on that poster because that poster tells me what I want to see.
Yes, yeah. And it did look sort of more like an old-fashioned adventure movie.
Totally.
Yeah, it sort of looked, I don't know, 50s as well as contemporary. We quite enjoyed it. Yeah, I took my older girls who were 13 and 15. We laughed. We had a good fun. It didn't quite have the atmosphere that I wanted it to have, but yeah, no, it was good. It was
it was just a little too much leaning on the Pirates of the Caribbean fantasy side.
Yes,
I could have done without that element to it.
Yeah,
I did enjoy it, but the best thrill I had was I watched it with my sister. She's a little bit older than me. Has very set films that she likes to see and not see. Mm-hmm. She loves the Pirates of the Caribbean films, so I knew that was a good bet in terms of Jungle Cruise. She absolutely adored it. I mean, absolutely. And so just to see the pleasure of her seeing a film properly presented for the first time, she hadn't been to the cinema for a year and a half, but to see something properly presented that she enjoyed gave me even more pleasure than the film itself, I would say.
Isn't that the great thing, though, about film, is that we can all come out with a different opinion, but it doesn't ultimately matter. Like I know when all the divisive stuff happened over the Star Wars sequels, I wasn't a huge fan of them, but I didn't go around saying this should have happened, that. I said, I'm really glad you enjoyed it, because you're enjoying it like I enjoyed those original movies, and I know how you feel, and that's great. Yeah.
Absolutely. I on each case, so obviously I was at the cast and crew screening of Force, and I'd already pre-booked to see it the following day with some friends of mine who were Star Wars fans. And so I saw it with the cast and crew, which is obviously a completely different experience anyway, isn't it? And then came out, obviously had things about it I hadn't liked, and then went to see it again with my friends in a cinema with people who paid to buy their tickets, and it was just the pleasure of seeing a film in a cinema with people cheering and clapping and all those things. And I did the same with 8, and I did the same with 9, on occasion. In fact, 9 actually came out when we were cutting to Olivia, and we knew we couldn't go off that evening because we knew we were going to be too busy with rushes. So Chris Frith and I, my assistant, we got up at 6 a.m. We drove to a cinema at 7 a.m. We watched episode 9. we turned off our phones. We came out at 9:30. We turned our phones on with text from the producer, and we go, we're just walking into we're heading to room right now, all of which was true. But we did not tell them we hadn't been contactable for 2.5 hours while we watched the Star Wars film, because it was really important to us,
Well,
because all of our friends had worked on it,
yeah.
and we wanted to see how it ended. And then we did our, 16-hour day, or whatever it was, 14-hour day anyway. But we started at 9:30 for a change, as opposed to starting at 8 a.m., which we normally do.
It's great though that you're still interested and supportive of what your colleagues and they're essentially your rivals in the freelance world, let's face it. But what is it that's still on the horizon for you? Something that would be the dream project to do now? Is there anything that you haven't done that you would love to do?
I would have adored to have cut the new Indiana Jones film. And there's two reasons behind that. One is I love the Indiana Jones films. I will still watch Crystal Skull. There are many, many things wrong with that film, but I will still watch it because there are many things in it that give me pleasure. And why would I reduce the pleasure parts for the parts that I don't like?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas Raiders is just personally filmmaking perfection.
Yes, completely.
There's two things in that film that I would improve. If I could get into that film now in a digital environment, I would fix the terrible continuity error of Marion with the necklace around her neck, which always bugs me. It's bugged me since the first time I ever saw the movie. It still annoys me, and I would digitally just paint that out. And there's another cut in the same scene that's continuity. I can't even remember what it is now. There's one other fix I do. Apart from that, it's a perfect film. And the other reason is Raiders was the first film set I ever managed to get onto.
Did you?
Yeah, I lied my way onto the film set.
Wow.
I contacted Elstree Studios, and I'll give you the long version if you want.
Go on.
Cut it down. Saw Empire Strikes Back, pretty much the third greatest film ever made, and knew that I couldn't be waiting 3 years for another movie. George had a trick. George is seriously making the new film now. He's got to be, right? Red Screen International, Elstree Studios, I knew they'd shot the other two movies there. Lawrence Kasdan screenplay, I knew he'd written Empire Strikes Back. Stars Harrison Ford, I know he's Han Solo. It's being directed by Steven Spielberg. It has to be the third Star Wars film. It all makes complete and utter sense. How do I get on the set of a Star Wars film that's being made by Lucasfilm, directed by Spielberg, starring Harrison Ford? I phone up Elstree Studios. I tell them I'm a journalist working for the British film industry, doing an article in the British film industry, and can I come and do a tour of the studios? They say yes. I'm 18 years at this time. By the way, I'm 18 years old. 19. I have to borrow my dad's suit, briefcase, and my friend Mike, who's standing next to me, who I've been at school and art college and film school with. Mike goes, and me. I go, can I bring a photographer? And they go, yes. So we borrow a 35mm stills camera, and because we didn't have one, and we go to Elstree, and the managing director gives us a tour of Green Ice, the Omar Sharif, Ryan O'Neill film, and Archer. He gives us a tour of, he says, we can't go into the Shining set because it's closed, the Kubrick set. We can't go to John Reed, Louis Bryant, Warren Beatty set because it's closed set. And we're thinking, oh, damn. And he goes, but you can go and see Steven Spielberg directing this George Lucas film. So he takes us on this. He goes, first of all, I'll take you on the sets we just finished filming on. We're just waiting for Rush's clearance before we wrap them. And he takes us into the sequence of the huge ball. And he goes, he's going to move this idol. It's going to collapse. This whole set collapsed. The ball rolls down here. His character runs out through here. And then we can re-rig it between every take. And we are like thinking, this is the greatest ending to a movie ever. Because that's an ending to a movie. And then he goes, oh, Stephen's over in the thing called the Well of Souls, this temple with all these snakes filming this thing going through the wall. Do you want to go see that? And we go, yep. The other thing that's going through our heads is this isn't a Star Wars film. Yeah. And we go in and still words up in the ceiling filming. And it's the sequence with he's up there doing the bit falling over and stuff. And greatest day of my life, basically. And
did you take any pictures?
Here's the thing. So we were taking pictures outside and stuff, but when we were inside, they took us to the workshops where they were building the flying wing. And Mike, the camera goes click, and the guy turns around. He goes, oh, what'd you take a picture of? And Mike goes, oh, the guy over there planing that piece of wood. And he goes, oh, okay, you didn't get the plane in, did you? Because we're not allowed to photograph that. And Mike goes, oh, no, because not a digital camera. It's a 35mm stills camera. Couldn't check. And he goes, okay, so long as you don't film that, that's fine. Well, of course, Mike had taken a picture of the flying wing. Now that picture of the flying wing is now in the Lucasfilm archives because they don't have one. And when I told them that story when I was going around the archives, they went, "Oh God, can we get a copy of that picture?" It is now in the archives.
How funny that you came full circle, though, Colin. Just
so I would have adored to have edited the new Indiana Jones film, or co-edited, or story edited, or anything. I would love to have done that film. And I would love to cut another musical. I've effectively worked on 3 musicals. Technically, I edited Stephen Sondheim's Follies, which was a concert film shot in 1985, starred Elaine Stritch and Lee Remick and Mandy Patinkin. And that was one of the hardest jobs I've ever done in my life because it was shot on 4 cameras, all on film, one of which was turning over at 24 frames per second. The other 3 were turning over at 25 frames per second because they cocked it up. And we had to deliver a finished film that was, basically running at 25, and we couldn't speed up this dialogue because it's music. So we had to, and this is not cut non-linear, people. This was cut on film. We were cutting this physically on film. And the other film, I cut a 3-part ITV comedy drama series starring Robson and Jerome back in 1996 called Ain't Misbehaving, which was a comedy where they are musicians. And I loved that, cutting that. It was cutting with Norman Stone, the director, who I then worked on subsequently for the next 20 years. Cut his first feature, actually. And Norman's a BAFTA award-winning, Emmy award-winning director. He wrote the original Shadowlands with Bill Nicholson and directed Shadowlands. So I would love to do a musical. I would have loved to have cut Everyone's Talking About Jamie. I think, that when I heard they were doing that, I was like, damn, I would love to be cutting that. So, all West Side Story.
Yeah. And I guess given somebody, of your caliber, you've had to turn down some things that you wish you'd done as well. That must be a frustrating part.
I've turned down, like, Rogue is the only big movie on my CV, and it is by no means the only big film I've ever been offered. I've turned down some huge films because I was offered a big movie after Rogue, but my mum was terminally ill, and I was like, I've not seen my mum for 2.5 years. I'm going to spend the last 6 months of my mum's life with my mum, which I did. And then I turned down other films because of personal reasons, for family reasons. And my dad's just passed away, so I've just turned down big films this summer. This whole summer when everybody's working, I'm the only person not working because I'm now clearing out my dad's house. Because I can't dial it in. I cannot just turn up and do 8 hours and go off and not care about the film. And I know that most films require a lot more than an 8-hour day.
Yeah, you need to be fully committed.
Particularly big films. And so I don't want to say yes to stuff and then sneak off and clear my dad's house of a weekend or of an evening. It's one or the other for me. You get me or you don't get me. Annoyingly, the big stuff I've been offered with directors that I've been desperate to work with, big Hollywood directors that I've admired, it's just the timing has been, I'm going to have to say no.
It happens, yeah.
Who knows? So my next thing I'm going to do is, that does mean that I'm going to do a short film because it's only a few weeks work and I can fit that in, and that's directed by Maxine Peake, and obviously Maxine is one of our best actresses. She's directing it, she's not starring in it, and I really want to work with her. I loved her pop videos that she's directed, and she directed another short film, and so that's purely to work with her and with the rest of the people. It's an almost exclusively female production, female writer, cast, director, DOP, makeup, producers, and me. So, so that will be great to do that.
I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Colin. I think we'll be in contact with each other for some time to come. Colin was very gracious in inviting me to his birthday party in Green Park in the summer. I had a lovely evening there chatting to people in the industry, including other editors and directors and VFX artists. Really did appreciate having that evening. It was one of my first social engagements back in the world after the sort of a year and a half of lockdown. So for the next episode, I have another editor, Sean Barton, who edited, among other movies, Return of the Jedi, a film I saw at the Dominion Theatre on my 7th birthday. My daughter has just turned 7 today, actually. One of the other reasons why I'm a bit late in getting this podcast done. And that experience of going up to London and going to Hamleys and buying all the Star Wars toys and being there with my sister and my cousins and my auntie, my uncle and my mum and dad is very much on my mind today as I remind myself what it feels like to be 7 years old. My interview with Sean will be the first proper in-person interview, COVID protocols in place, of course, and will be taking place next week, the first week of October 2021, and released shortly after that, all being well. So I look forward to doing that and getting that one out to you listeners. Thanks again for joining me. Please spread the word about this little independent podcast. It is just me. And also take a couple of minutes to post maybe a glowingly positive review on Apple Podcasts, because apparently that really helps to get a podcast noticed. And us little independent podcasts are getting a bit buried at the moment. I really would love just to be the #1 film history podcast in my home country, in the UK. I'd just love to see that. That was kind of one of my aims when I started this. I just want to get this stuff out to people. It's not about ego. It's just about sharing these stories and just, you're like me, hopefully. I do this for me and I do this for people like me, and you are those people. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you can join me again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
I'm one with the Force is with me. I'm one with the Force is with me. And the Force is with me. I'm one with the Force is with me. I'm one with the Force is with me. I'm one with the Force and the Force is with me.